The sun was already low in the sky when I decided to take the trail. I had been driving for hours, the kind of aimless driving you do when you're trying to outrun something you can't quite name. The kind of driving that leaves you with a stiff neck and a hollow feeling in your chest. I pulled into the parking lot of the state park, the gravel crunching under my tires. The lot was empty except for a single beat-up truck with a bumper sticker that read, "Hunt hard, live free." I didn't think much of it at the time. I just wanted to walk, to feel the ground beneath my feet, to breathe air that wasn't stale with the scent of my own anxiety. I grabbed my backpack from the passenger seat. It was an old thing, frayed at the edges, but it had been with me on every hike I'd ever taken. Inside, I had a water bottle, a protein bar, a flashlight, and a pocket knife. I didn't plan on being out long, just an hour or two, enough to clear my head. The trailhead was marked by a wooden sign, the letters carved deep into the grain. Black Pine Trail, 5 miles. I glanced at my watch. It was 4:30 p.m., plenty of time to get back before dark. The first mile was easy. The trail wound through a dense forest, the trees so tall they blocked out most of the sunlight. The air was cool and damp, the kind of cool that makes you feel alive. I could hear birds chirping somewhere high above, and the occasional rustle of leaves as a squirrel darted across the path. My boots crunched on the dirt, the sound steady and reassuring. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. But as I walked, the forest began to change. The trees grew closer together, their branches twisting and tangling overhead. The sunlight faded, replaced by a dim, greenish glow that made everything look sickly. The birds stopped chirping. The only sound was the crunch of my boots and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the quiet get to me. But the further I went, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. By the time I reached the 2nd-mile marker, the trail had narrowed to little more than a footpath. The trees were so close I had to turn sideways to get through some spots. The air felt heavier, thicker, like I was breathing through a wet cloth. I stopped for a moment to take a drink of water, and that's when I noticed it. A faint, metallic smell, like blood or rust. I looked around, but there was nothing, just the trees and the shadows and that awful smell. I kept walking faster now. The trail began to slope downward, the ground growing softer underfoot. My boots sank into the mud with each step, the sound wet and sucking. The smell grew stronger, so strong I could taste it in the back of my throat. I told myself it was just a dead animal, something a bear or a coyote had killed. But the rational part of my brain was starting to lose ground to the part that screamed at me to turn around, to get out while I still could. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a rock, something dark and jagged sticking out of the mud. But as I got closer, I realized it was a boot with a foot still inside it. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. The boot was old, the leather cracked and peeling, the sole coming apart at the seams. The foot inside was skeletal, the flesh long since rotted away. I took a step back, my stomach churning, and that's when I saw the rest of it. There was a body, or what was left of one. It was half buried in the mud, the bones sticking out at odd angles. The skull was tilted back, the jaw hanging open like it was screaming. The clothes were tattered, barely more than rags, but I could see the faint outline of a logo on the chest, a hiking brand I recognized. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. How long had it been here? Weeks? Months? Years? I stumbled backward, my boots slipping in the mud. I wanted to run, to get as far away from this place as I could, but my legs wouldn't move. I just stood there, staring at the body, at the way the mud seemed to cling to it, like the forest was trying to pull it down, to swallow it whole. And then I heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable. The snap of a twig. I spun around, my heart in my throat. The forest was silent, the trees standing still as statues. But I could feel it, the same way you can feel someone watching you even when you can't see them. I took a step forward, then another, my eyes scanning the shadows. Nothing moved, nothing made a sound, but the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got stronger. I started walking again, faster this time. The trail was barely visible now, the ground so soft it felt like I was walking on a sponge. The trees were so close together I had to push through them, the branches scraping against my arms and face. The smell was overwhelming, a mix of rot and something else, something sharp and chemical. I could feel it in my lungs, burning with every breath. And then I saw the second body. This one was fresher, the flesh still clinging to the bones. The clothes were intact, a bright red jacket that stood out against the mud like a bloodstain. The face was gone, eaten away by animals or insects, but I could see the hair, long and dark, matted with dirt and leaves. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. I knelt down, my hands shaking, and reached for the jacket. There was a name stitched into the fabric, Emily. I dropped the jacket like it was on fire. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what was happening. Two bodies, both hikers, both dead. Was this some kind of trap? A serial killer? Or was it something else? Something worse? I didn't know, but I knew I had to get out of there. I stood up, my legs trembling, and started walking again. The trail was gone now, swallowed up by the mud and the trees. I was just moving forward, pushing through the underbrush, my arms and face stinging from the scratches. The forest seemed to go on forever, the trees stretching out in every direction. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, the kind of panic that makes your vision blur and your hands go numb. I wanted to scream, to cry, to do anything but keep walking. But I didn't have a choice. And then I saw the light. It was faint at first, just a glimmer through the trees. But as I got closer, it grew brighter until I could see it clearly. A clearing with sunlight streaming down from above. I almost cried with relief. I pushed through the last of the trees and stumbled into the clearing, my legs giving out beneath me. I fell to my knees, the ground hard and dry under my hands. I took a deep breath, the air clean and sweet, and for the first time in what felt like hours, I felt like I could breathe again. But the relief didn't last long. I looked up and that's when I saw it. The clearing wasn't empty. There were things here, things that made my blood run cold. There were piles of bones, stacked neatly like firewood. There were clothes hung from the trees like some kind of macabre decoration. And there were tools, knives, axes, things that looked like they belonged in a butcher shop. My stomach turned, and I had to fight the urge to vomit. And then I saw the cabin. It was small, barely more than a shack, with walls made of rough-hewn logs and a roof covered in moss. The windows were dark, the door hanging open like a gaping mouth. I didn't want to go inside, but I didn't have a choice. I needed to know. I needed to see. I stood up, my legs shaking, and walked toward the cabin. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound loud in the silence. The inside was dark, the air thick with the smell of rot and something else, something sweet and sickly. I fumbled for my flashlight and turned it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. What I saw made my blood run cold. The walls were covered in photographs, hundreds of them, pinned up like some kind of twisted collage. They were all hikers, men and women, young and old, smiling at the camera like they didn't have a care in the world. And then there were the other photos, the ones that made my stomach turn. Photos of bodies, of bones, of things I didn't want to think about. I recognized some of the faces from the trail, from the bodies I had seen. And then I saw her, Emily, the girl from the jacket. She was smiling in the photo, her hair blowing in the wind, her eyes bright and full of life. I couldn't look anymore. I turned away, my hands shaking, and that's when I saw the table. It was covered in tools, the same kind of tools I had seen outside. There were knives, saws, things I didn't even want to name. And there was something else, something that made my heart stop. A map with the trail marked in red and little X's scattered along the path. I didn't need to count them to know what they meant. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I had to get out of there. I had to run. But as I turned toward the door, I heard it. The sound of footsteps, heavy and slow, coming from outside. My heart stopped. I looked around, my eyes darting from one shadow to the next, but there was nowhere to hide. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were right outside the door. And then it stopped. The silence was worse than the footsteps. I could feel it, the weight of it pressing down on me like a physical thing. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the trail as I tightened the straps on my backpack. I had been planning this hike for weeks, a solo trek through the dense woods of the Black Ridge National Park. The map promised a challenging but rewarding route, with a stunning overlook at the end. I had told myself this would be a chance to clear my head, to get away from the noise of the city and the constant buzz of my phone. But as I stood at the trailhead, staring into the darkening forest, I felt a small knot of unease tighten in my stomach. I shook it off. This was what I wanted: solitude, nature, adventure. The first mile was easy. The trail was well marked, and the air was cool and crisp. The sound of my boots crunching on the gravel path was steady and reassuring. Birds chirped in the distance, and the occasional rustle of leaves reminded me that I wasn't entirely alone. I passed a couple of hikers on their way back to the parking lot, exchanging nods and brief smiles. They looked tired but content, their faces flushed from the exertion. I wondered if I'd look the same when I returned. By the time I reached the 2nd-mile marker, the sun had fully set, and the forest was bathed in a deep, almost oppressive darkness. I switched on my headlamp, the beam cutting through the blackness like a knife. The trail narrowed here, the trees pressing in on either side. The air felt heavier, damp and cold, and the sounds of the forest seemed to grow quieter, as if the woods were holding their breath. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the night always felt different in the wilderness. But the knot in my stomach was back, tighter this time. I kept walking, my pace steady but slower now. The trail began to climb, the incline sharp and unrelenting. My legs burned, and my breath came in short, ragged bursts. I focused on the beam of my headlamp, on the small circle of light it cast on the ground in front of me. The darkness beyond that light felt vast and endless, like I was walking through a void. I tried to shake the feeling, to remind myself that I was still on the trail, that I was still safe. But the further I went, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. It was around the 3rd mile that I first noticed the sound. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible, a soft, rhythmic crunching, like footsteps. I stopped, my heart pounding in my chest, and listened. The sound stopped too. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer or a raccoon, something harmless. But when I started walking again, the sound came back, matching my pace exactly. I stopped again, and again the sound stopped. My mouth went dry, and I could feel the sweat trickling down my back despite the cold. I told myself to stay calm, to keep moving. Maybe it was just an echo, or the sound of my own footsteps bouncing off the trees. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I picked up my pace, my boots slamming against the ground with more force than necessary. The sound kept up with me, never getting closer, but never falling behind either. My breath came faster now, my chest heaving as I pushed myself to move quicker. The trail was steep here, the rocks loose and slippery underfoot. I stumbled once, catching myself on a tree trunk, the bark rough and cold against my palm. I didn't stop, couldn't stop. The sound was still there, still following me. By the time I reached the 4th mile, I was running. My legs screamed in protest, my lungs burning with the effort, but I didn't care. The sound was louder now, closer. I could hear it clearly. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, my headlamp bouncing wildly as I sprinted up the trail. The beam of light caught glimpses of the forest around me. Gnarled tree roots, jagged rocks, the occasional flash of a reflective trail marker. But mostly, there was just darkness, endless and suffocating. I don't know how long I ran. Felt like hours, but it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. My legs gave out eventually, and I collapsed against a tree, gasping for air. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and my vision swam with spots of light. I forced myself to breathe, to listen. The sound was gone. The forest was silent again, except for the sound of my own ragged breathing. I slumped against the tree, my legs trembling, and tried to calm down. Maybe it had been an animal after all. Maybe I had just panicked for no reason. But as I sat there, trying to catch my breath, I noticed something else. The air smelled different, sharp and metallic, like blood. I frowned, sniffing the air. The smell was faint, but it was there, unmistakable. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs still shaky, and shone my headlamp around. The beam of light caught something on the ground a few feet away, something dark and wet. I took a step closer, my stomach churning. It was blood, fresh and glistening in the light. My heart skipped a beat, and I took a step back, my mind racing. What the hell had happened here? I didn't want to stay and find out. I turned and started walking again, my pace quick but controlled. The trail was even narrower here, the trees so close together that their branches intertwined overhead, blocking out the sky. The air felt thicker, heavier, and the smell of blood seemed to follow me, clinging to the back of my throat. I tried to focus on the trail, on the beam of my headlamp, but my mind kept wandering back to the blood, to the footsteps, to the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was around the 5th mile that I saw the first sign of civilization. A small wooden cabin, barely visible through the trees. My heart leapt at the sight of it. Maybe there was someone there, someone who could help me. I quickened my pace, my boots crunching on the gravel as I approached the cabin. It was old, the wood weathered and gray, and the windows were dark. There was no smoke coming from the chimney, no signs of life, but it was better than nothing. I knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the silent forest. There was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time, and called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" My voice sounded small and weak, swallowed by the vastness of the woods. Still no answer. I tried the door, and to my surprise, it creaked open. The inside of the cabin was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of mildew. I shone my headlamp around, the beam of light revealing a small, sparsely furnished room. There was a table, a chair, and a cot in the corner, but no sign of anyone living there. I stepped inside, my heart still pounding. The cabin felt safer than the forest, at least for now. I closed the door behind me, the wood groaning as it swung shut. The sound was loud in the silence, and I flinched. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, and sat down on the cot. My legs were still trembling, and my head was spinning. I needed to think, to figure out what to do next. But my mind was a jumble of fear and confusion, and I couldn't focus. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the wall, but eventually, I realized that the smell of blood was gone. The air in the cabin was stale and musty, but it didn't have that sharp, metallic tang anymore. I frowned, sniffing the air again. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the whole thing had been in my head. But the blood on the trail had been real, hadn't it? Couldn't be sure anymore. I stood up, my legs still shaky, and walked over to the window. The glass was grimy, covered in a thick layer of dust, but I could just make out the outline of the forest outside. It was still dark, the trees looming like silent sentinels. I felt a pang of unease, but I pushed it down. I couldn't stay here forever. I had to keep moving to get to the overlook and then back to the trailhead. The sooner I got out of these woods, the better. I opened the door and stepped back out into the night. The air was cold and damp, and the forest was silent. Too silent. I shone my headlamp around, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The trail was still there, just a few feet away, and I started walking again, my pace quick but steady. The smell of blood was gone, and the sound of footsteps was gone, but the knot in my stomach was still there, tight and unrelenting. The trail began to climb again, the incline steep and unrelenting. My legs burned with the effort, but I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees pressing in on either side, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The beam of my headlamp was the only thing keeping me grounded, the only thing keeping me from getting lost in the darkness. I focused on it, on the small circle of light it cast on the ground in front of me, and kept walking. It was around the 6th mile that I saw the first sign of the overlook, a wooden signpost, barely visible through the trees. My heart leapt at the sight of it. I was almost there. I quickened my pace, my boots slamming against the ground as I pushed myself to move faster. The sun was already low in the sky when I decided to take the trail. I'd been planning this hike for weeks, but life kept getting in the way. Work, errands, the usual excuses. But today I finally had the time. The trail was one I'd never done before. A winding path through dense woods that promised a view of the valley below. I'd read about it online, moderate difficulty, about 6 miles round trip, perfect for an afternoon. I packed my bag with the essentials. Water, a flashlight, a protein bar, and a light jacket. The weather was mild, but the mountains had a way of turning on you. Better safe than sorry. I parked my car at the trailhead, the only one in the lot. It was a weekday, and most people were probably still at work. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that bites just enough to remind you it's there. I tightened my laces, adjusted my backpack, and started walking. The trail was well marked, at least at first. Yellow blazes painted on trees guided the way. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. It felt good to be alone, to be moving. The rhythm of my footsteps was steady, calming. The first mile was easy. The trail sloped gently upward, and the trees were spaced far enough apart to let in plenty of light. I could see why people liked this hike. It was peaceful, the kind of place where you could forget about everything else for a while. I kept my pace steady, not too fast, not too slow. I wanted to make it to the overlook before sunset. The thought of watching the sun dip below the horizon from up there was what had drawn me to this trail in the first place. But as I went deeper, the woods began to change. The trees grew closer together, their branches twisting overhead like a canopy. The light dimmed, and the air felt heavier, damp. The trail narrowed, the dirt path giving way to roots and rocks. I had to watch my step more carefully. The yellow blazes were still there, but they were harder to spot. I found myself stopping more often to make sure I was still on the right path. By the time I reached the second mile, the sun was almost gone. The sky was a deep orange, streaked with purple and pink. Beautiful, but it meant I was running out of time. I picked up my pace, my boots crunching on the dry leaves. The trail was steeper now, and my legs were starting to ache. I told myself it was just a little farther. The overlook had to be close, but it wasn't. The trail kept going, winding higher and higher. The trees were so thick now that I could barely see the sky. The air was colder, too, and I could feel the sweat on my back starting to chill. I pulled out my flashlight, even though it wasn't fully dark yet. The beam cut through the gloom, casting long shadows on the ground. I kept walking, my breath coming in short puffs. The silence was unnerving. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my own footsteps. And then I saw it, a fork in the trail. 2 paths, both marked with yellow blazes. I stopped, confused. The map I'd looked at online hadn't mentioned a split. I stood there for a moment, trying to decide which way to go. The left path looked more worn, so I took it. But after a few minutes, I realized it was leading me downhill, away from the overlook. I turned back, my heart starting to race. The sun was almost gone now, and the woods were getting darker by the minute. I took the right path this time, moving faster. The trail was rougher here, more overgrown. Branches scraped against my arms, and I had to duck under low-hanging limbs. My flashlight flickered, and I shook it, hoping it wasn't dying. The beam steadied, but the battery was definitely low. I cursed myself for not bringing extra batteries. Stupid mistake. The trail seemed to go on forever. My legs were burning, and my throat was dry. I stopped to take a sip of water, but I didn't want to drink too much. I didn't know how much longer I'd be out here. The thought of spending the night in these woods crossed my mind, but I pushed it away. I had to keep going. And then, finally, I saw it. A break in the trees. I hurried toward it, my heart pounding. But when I reached the clearing, it wasn't the overlook. It was just a small, rocky outcrop, barely big enough to stand on. I looked around, confused. This couldn't be it. The overlook was supposed to be a wide, open space with a view of the valley. This was nothing. I pulled out my phone, hoping to check the map, but there was no signal. Of course, I was in the middle of nowhere. I felt a pang of panic, but I forced myself to stay calm. I just have to retrace my steps. I turned around and started back down the trail, moving as quickly as I could. But the woods looked different in the dark. The trees all seemed the same, and the trail was hard to follow. I kept stopping to check for the yellow blazes, but they were few and far between. After what felt like an hour, I realized I was lost. The trail had disappeared, and I was just wandering through the trees. My flashlight was dimming, and my water was almost gone. I tried to think clearly, to remember which way I'd come from, but it was no use. The woods were too dense, too dark. I was completely turned around. I sat down on a fallen log, my hands shaking. I needed to rest, just for a minute. But as I sat there, I heard something, a rustling in the bushes. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was probably just an animal, but in the dark, it sounded much bigger. I stood up slowly, my flashlight pointed in the direction of the noise. The beam was so weak now that I could barely see a few feet in front of me. The rustling came again, closer this time. I took a step back, my heart pounding, and then I saw it. A pair of eyes, reflecting the light. They were low to the ground, but they were too far apart to be a deer. My mind raced. A bear? A mountain lion? I didn't know what lived in these woods, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush. Branches whipped at my face, and my boots slipped on the wet leaves. I didn't care. I just had to get away. I ran until my lungs felt like they were on fire, until my legs gave out and I collapsed on the ground. I lay there, gasping for air, my ears straining for any sound. But the woods were silent again. Whatever had been following me was gone. I got up slowly, my body aching. My flashlight was almost dead, but I could see a faint glow in the distance. It was hard to tell through the trees, but it looked like light. I started walking toward it, my steps shaky but determined. The glow grew brighter as I got closer, and soon I could see the outline of a building. A cabin, maybe? I didn't care what it was. It was shelter. I stumbled into the clearing, my legs barely holding me up. The cabin was small, with a single window and a door that hung slightly open. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open and stepped inside. It was dark, but it was dry, and that was enough. I sank to the floor, my back against the wall, and closed my eyes. I was safe, for now. The next thing I knew, it was morning. Sunlight streamed through the window, and I could hear birds chirping outside. I sat up, my body stiff and sore. The cabin was just as I'd left it, empty but solid. I stood up and walked to the door, squinting in the bright light. The woods looked different in the daylight, less menacing. I could see the trail not far from the cabin, the yellow blazes clear and bright. I took a deep breath and started walking. The trail led me back the way I'd come, and within an hour, I was back at the trailhead. My car was still there, just as I'd left it. I got in and sat there for a long time, just staring at the steering wheel. I'd made it. I was okay. But as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been lucky. Too lucky. The woods were beautiful, but they were also dangerous. I'd learned that the hard way. Next time, I'd be more prepared. Next time, I wouldn't take the trail for granted. And I wouldn't go alone. The sun was already low in the sky when I decided to take the trail. I had been planning this hike for weeks, but work and life kept getting in the way. Today, though, I had no excuses. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold. The kind of autumn day where the air smells like dried leaves and distant wood smoke. The trail was one I'd never done before. A narrow path that wound through dense woods and promised a view of a hidden lake at the end. I had my backpack with me. Water, a few protein bars, a flashlight, and a light jacket. I didn't plan to be out long. Just a quick hike to clear my head, maybe an hour or two at most. The trail started easy enough. The ground was soft underfoot, covered in a thick layer of pine needles and fallen leaves. The trees were tall and close together, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into scattered patches on the ground. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like the woods were holding their breath. I could hear the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird, but otherwise, it was just me and the sound of my own footsteps. I walked for what felt like an hour, though I wasn't keeping track of time. The trail was steeper than I expected, and my legs were starting to ache. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath, leaning against a tree. The bark was rough against my palm, and I could feel the chill of the air seeping through my shirt. I took a sip of water and looked around. The woods looked different now. The trees seemed closer together, their branches twisting in ways that made them look almost human. The light was fading faster than I thought it would, and the shadows were growing longer. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the woods always look different as the sun goes down. But there was a part of me that felt uneasy, like I was being watched. I shook off the feeling and kept walking. The trail was harder to follow now, the path less clear. The markers, little yellow squares nailed to the trees, were spaced farther apart, and I had to stop several times to make sure I was still going the right way. The ground was uneven, riddled with roots and rocks that seemed to appear out of nowhere. My boots slipped on the damp leaves, and I had to grab onto branches to keep my balance. My hands were sticky with sap, and the smell of pine was overwhelming. The woods were darker now, the sun almost completely gone. I pulled out my flashlight and turned it on. The beam cut through the darkness, but it didn't reach far. The trees seemed to swallow the light, their trunks looming like walls on either side of me. I could hear the sound of my own breathing, loud and uneven. My heart was pounding, though I wasn't sure why. I told myself it was just the exertion, the steep climb, the weight of my backpack. But the feeling of unease was growing stronger, like a knot tightening in my chest. I kept walking, my flashlight bouncing with each step. The trail was barely visible now, just a narrow strip of dirt between the trees. I could hear the sound of water in the distance, a faint trickle that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I thought it must be the lake, the one the trail was supposed to lead to. But the sound didn't get any louder as I walked, and the trail didn't seem to be leading me anywhere. It just kept winding through the trees, up and down, over roots and rocks, with no end in sight. I stopped again, my legs trembling. My water was almost gone, and my throat was dry. I could feel the cold now, seeping through my jacket and into my bones. My hands were shaking, and I had to grip the flashlight tightly to keep it from slipping. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. The trees all looked the same, their trunks dark and gnarled, their branches twisting together overhead. The trail behind me was just as dark as the trail ahead, and I couldn't remember how long I'd been walking. It felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. Time didn't seem to mean anything in the woods. I took a deep breath and kept going. The sound of water was louder now, but it still didn't seem to be getting any closer. The trail dipped suddenly, and I stumbled, my foot catching on a root. I fell hard, my knees hitting the ground, my hands scraping against the dirt. The flashlight slipped from my grip and rolled away, its beam flickering as it bounced over the uneven ground. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing, and grabbed the flashlight. The beam was dimmer now, the battery dying. I shook it, and the light flickered again, but it didn't get any brighter. I kept walking, my pace faster now. The trail was steeper, the ground slick with mud. My boots slipped again, and I had to grab onto a tree to keep from falling. My hands were cold and numb, and my fingers felt stiff as I gripped the bark. The sound of water was louder now, almost deafening. I could feel it in my chest, a low rumble that made my teeth ache. The trail turned sharply, and I followed it, my flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. And then I saw it, the lake. It was smaller than I expected, just a dark circle of water surrounded by trees. The surface was perfectly still, like glass, reflecting the pale light of the moon. The sound of water wasn't coming from the lake, though. It was coming from somewhere beyond it, a rushing sound that seemed to echo through the trees. I stood there for a moment, staring at the lake. It was beautiful in a way, but there was something about it that made my skin crawl. The water was too still, too dark, like it was hiding something beneath the surface. I walked closer, my footsteps crunching on the frozen ground. The air was colder here, and I could see my breath in the moonlight. I knelt by the edge of the lake, my flashlight flickering in my hand. The beam reflected off the water, casting strange shadows on the trees. I reached out, my fingers brushing the surface. The water was icy cold, and I pulled my hand back quickly, shaking off the droplets. I stood up and looked around. The trail seemed to end here at the edge of the lake. There was no sign of the rushing water I'd heard, no stream or river, just the lake, silent and still. I felt a sudden urge to leave, to turn around and go back the way I'd come. But the trail behind me was dark, and I wasn't sure I could find my way back. My flashlight was almost dead, and the woods seemed to stretch on forever in every direction. I took a deep breath and forced myself to think. I needed to find shelter, somewhere to wait out the night. The temperature was dropping fast, and I could feel the cold seeping into my clothes. I looked around, my flashlight beam sweeping over the trees. There was a small clearing a few feet away, just a patch of ground where the trees were thinner. I walked over to it, my footsteps crunching on the frozen leaves. The ground was hard and uneven, but it was dry at least. I set my backpack down and pulled out my jacket, wrapping it tightly around myself. I sat down, my back against a tree, and turned off the flashlight to save the battery. The woods were completely dark now, the moon hidden behind the trees. I could hear the sound of the wind in the branches, a low, mournful sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I closed my eyes and tried to steady my breathing. My heart was still racing, and my hands were shaking. I told myself it was just the cold, just the exhaustion. But there was a part of me that knew it was more than that. The woods felt wrong, like they were alive, like they were watching me. I don't know how long I sat there, shivering in the dark. Felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. My mind was racing, thoughts tumbling over each other. I thought about the trail, about how I'd gotten so lost. I thought about the lake, about how still and dark it was. I thought about the sound of water, about how it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And then I heard it again, louder this time, the sound of rushing water, like a river or a waterfall. It was close, so close that I could feel it in my chest. I stood up, my legs stiff and aching. My flashlight flickered as I turned it on, the beam weak and unsteady. I walked toward the sound, my footsteps crunching on the frozen ground. The trees were thicker here, their branches twisting together overhead. The sound of water was deafening now, a roar that seemed to shake the ground beneath my feet. I pushed through the trees, my hands scraping against the bark. And then I saw it, a river. It was wide and fast, the water churning and frothing as it rushed over rocks and fallen trees. The sound was overwhelming, a roar that drowned out everything else. I stood there for a moment, staring at the river. It was beautiful in a way, but there was something about it that made my stomach twist. The water was too fast, too wild, like it was alive. I could feel the spray on my face, cold and sharp, and the ground beneath my feet was slick with mud. I looked around, my flashlight beam sweeping over the trees. There was no bridge, no way to cross. The river was too wide, too deep. I felt a sudden surge of panic, my chest tightening. I was trapped. The trail had led me here to this river, and there was no way forward. I turned around, my flashlight flickering. The woods were dark, the trees looming like shadows. I couldn't see the trail, couldn't see anything but the trees. The sun was already low in the sky when I decided to take the trail. I'd been planning this hike for weeks, but work kept getting in the way. Now, with a rare free afternoon, I wasn't going to let the fading light stop me. The trail was supposed to be easy, just a loop through the woods, a few miles at most. I'd done my research, or so I thought. I packed my bag with the basics: water, a flashlight, a protein bar, and a light jacket. The weather was mild, the kind of late autumn day where the air feels crisp but not cold. The trees were bare, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. The ground was littered with fallen leaves, their colors muted now, brown and brittle underfoot. I parked my car at the trailhead, the only vehicle in the small gravel lot. The trail map was posted on a wooden board, faded and peeling from years of exposure. I glanced at it briefly, noting the loop and the markers. It seemed straightforward. I adjusted my backpack, took a swig of water, and started walking. The first mile was uneventful. The trail was well marked, with yellow blazes painted on the trees. The woods were quiet. The only sounds the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional rustle of a squirrel in the underbrush. The sunlight filtered through the trees in golden shafts, casting long shadows across the path. I felt good, my legs strong, my breath steady. This was exactly what I needed, a chance to clear my head, to be alone with my thoughts. But as I walked, the trail began to change. The markers became less frequent, the path narrower and more overgrown. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches tangling overhead. The sunlight faded, replaced by a dim, grayish light that made everything look the same. I checked my phone for the time, but there was no signal. I told myself it was fine. I'd just keep going, stick to the trail, and eventually I'd loop back to the start. The air grew colder as I walked, and I zipped up my jacket. The silence was unnerving now, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like it's pressing down on you. I tried to shake the feeling, to focus on the rhythm of my steps, but the unease stayed with me, a gnawing sensation in the pit of my stomach. I don't know when I first realized I was lost. It wasn't a sudden realization, more like a slow dawning. The trail markers had disappeared altogether, and the path had become a faint indentation in the leaves, barely visible. I stopped walking and looked around, trying to orient myself. The trees all looked the same, their trunks gray and gnarled, their branches twisting in every direction. The sky was a dull, uniform gray, giving no hint of the sun's position. I felt a pang of panic but pushed it down. Panic wouldn't help me. I needed to think. I decided to retrace my steps, to go back the way I'd come. But after walking for what felt like an hour, I realized I was going in circles. The same landmarks. A fallen tree, a cluster of rocks, kept appearing, as if the woods were playing a cruel trick on me. My heart was pounding now, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I told myself to stay calm, to keep moving, but the fear was creeping in, tightening its grip. The light was fading fast, the woods growing darker by the minute. I fumbled for my flashlight and turned it on, the beam cutting through the gloom. It didn't help much. The light seemed to bounce off the trees, creating strange shadows that danced at the edges of my vision. I kept walking, my footsteps quickening, my eyes darting from side to side. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, made me jump. My imagination ran wild, conjuring up images of things lurking in the shadows, waiting to pounce. I don't know how long I walked like that, my fear growing with every step. My legs were aching, my throat dry from breathing through my mouth. I stopped to take a sip of water, my hands trembling so badly I could barely unscrew the cap. The water was warm, but it helped a little. I forced myself to take deep breaths, to try to think clearly. I needed a plan. I decided to climb a tree, to see if I could get a better view of my surroundings. I found one with low branches and started climbing, my muscles protesting with every movement. The higher I climbed, the more the branches thinned out until I was near the top, clinging to the trunk for balance. I looked around, hoping to see something, a road, a house, anything. But all I saw was trees, endless trees stretching out in every direction. The sky was almost completely dark now, the first stars appearing overhead. I felt a wave of despair, but I pushed it down. Couldn't give up. Not yet. I climbed back down, my legs shaking from the effort. I decided to keep walking, to follow the faint path and hope it led somewhere. The flashlight's beam was growing weaker, the batteries running low. I walked faster, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my chest. The woods seemed to close in around me, the trees pressing closer, the shadows deepening. I felt like I was being watched, like something was following me, just out of sight. I didn't dare look back. And then, just when I thought I couldn't go on, I saw it. A light, faint but unmistakable, through the trees. I almost cried with relief. I stumbled toward it, my legs weak, my vision blurry. The light grew brighter as I got closer, until I could see its source. A small cabin, its windows glowing with a warm, golden light. I didn't care who lived there or how they felt about strangers. I just needed help. I reached the cabin and knocked on the door, my hand trembling. There was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time, and called out, my voice hoarse. Still no answer. I tried the door, and to my surprise, it was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped inside, the warmth of the room enveloping me like a blanket. The cabin was small but cozy, with a fire crackling in the hearth and a table set for one. There was no one there, but the fire was fresh, the embers still glowing. I called out again, but there was no response. I didn't care. I was safe, and that was all that mattered. I sat down by the fire, my body trembling with exhaustion. I drank the rest of my water and ate the protein bar, the simple act of eating making me feel a little more human. I didn't know where the cabin's owner was, but I was too tired to care. I curled up on the floor by the fire, my eyes heavy, and let myself drift off to sleep. When I woke up, the fire had died down to embers, and the cabin was cold. The light from the windows was pale and gray, the first light of dawn. I sat up, my body stiff and aching, and looked around. The cabin was just as I'd left it, the table still set, the door still open. I stood up and walked to the door, looking out into the woods. The trees were still there, silent and watchful, but the fear was gone. I felt a strange sense of calm, as if the woods had tested me and found me worthy. I stepped outside, the cool morning air sharp in my lungs. The trail was there, clear and well-marked, leading back the way I'd come. I didn't question it. I just started walking, my steps steady, my mind clear. The sun rose as I walked, its light filtering through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew I'd find my way. When I reached the trailhead, my car was still there, the only vehicle in the lot. I got in and started the engine, the familiar sound comforting. I drove home, the events of the night already fading, like a dream. But I knew I'd remember that cabin, that fire, that sense of calm. And I knew I'd be back. The woods had called to me, and I had answered, and I would answer again. The sun was already low in the sky when I decided to take the trail. I'd been meaning to do this hike for weeks, but work and life kept getting in the way. Today, though, I had no excuses. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that bites at your nose but feels refreshing in your lungs. I tightened the straps on my backpack, checked my water bottle, and started up the path. The trail was supposed to be a loop, about 6 miles total, with a viewpoint halfway through that overlooked the valley. I'd read about it online, and the photos looked stunning. I wasn't much of a photographer, but I figured it'd be a good excuse to get outside and clear my head. The first mile was easy. The trail was well marked, wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, and the ground was packed dirt with a few scattered rocks. The trees were tall here, mostly pines, and their needles covered the ground in a soft, brown carpet. The air smelled like earth and sap, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots and the occasional chirp of a bird. I felt good, strong, like I could walk forever. But as I went deeper into the woods, the trail started to change. The trees grew closer together, their branches twisting overhead like they were trying to block out the sun. The path narrowed, and the ground became uneven, littered with roots and loose stones. I had to watch my step, careful not to trip. The air felt heavier too, damp and cold, like it was clinging to my skin. I pulled my jacket tighter and kept walking. By the time I reached the viewpoint, the sun was almost gone. The sky was a deep orange, streaked with purple and pink, and the valley below was bathed in shadow. I stood there for a while, taking it all in. It was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about it too. The silence was too complete, like the world was holding its breath. I shook off the feeling and turned back to the trail. I still had 3 miles to go, and I didn't want to be out here after dark. The second half of the loop was supposed to be easier, according to the map. It was mostly downhill, with a few switchbacks to keep the slope manageable. But as I started down the trail, I realized something was wrong. The path was narrower than before, barely wide enough for one person, and the ground was loose and slippery. I had to move slowly, planting each foot carefully to keep from sliding. The trees here were different too, shorter and denser, with branches that reached out like they were trying to grab me. I pushed through them, feeling the scratch of twigs against my arms and face. After about 20 minutes, I stopped to check my map. I was sure I was on the right trail, but nothing looked familiar. The landmarks I'd memorized. A big rock shaped like a chair, a fallen tree with its roots sticking up in the air, were nowhere to be seen. I told myself I must have missed them in the fading light, but the doubt was already creeping in. I kept walking, faster now, my heart starting to race. The trail kept getting worse. The ground was so steep in places that I had to grab onto tree branches to keep from falling. My hands were scratched and dirty, and my legs were starting to ache. I kept telling myself it was just a little farther, that I'd see the parking lot any minute now, but the trail just kept going, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. The sun was completely gone now, and the woods were dark. I pulled out my flashlight, but the beam was weak, barely cutting through the blackness. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, but I pushed it down. I had to keep moving. Then I saw it. Up ahead, the trail split into 2 paths. I didn't remember seeing that on the map. I stood there for a moment, trying to decide which way to go. The left path looked wider, more worn, so I took it. But after a few minutes, I realized it was a mistake. The trail was leading me uphill again, back the way I'd come. I turned around, my heart pounding now, and started back down. But when I reached the split, the other path was gone. It was just gone, like it had never been there. I shone my flashlight around, but all I could see were trees and more trees. I was lost, really, truly lost. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I tried to stay calm, to think rationally, but my mind was racing. I didn't have a compass, and my phone had no signal. I was completely alone, in the middle of the woods, in the dark. I took a deep breath and told myself I'd figure it out. I'd just keep walking until I found the trail again. But the woods didn't let me go. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches clawing at my clothes and skin. The ground was uneven and slick, and I fell more than once, my hands and knees scraping against rocks and roots. My flashlight was dying, the beam flickering and dim. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, and my breath came out in white puffs. I was exhausted, but I couldn't stop. If I stopped, I might never start again. Hours passed, or maybe it was just minutes. Time didn't mean anything in the dark. I kept walking, stumbling, falling, getting back up. My legs were numb and my hands were raw. I was so tired, so cold, that I almost didn't notice when the trees started to thin. At first, I thought it was my imagination, wishful thinking. But then I saw it. A light, faint but steady, through the trees. I almost cried with relief. I pushed myself forward, my legs screaming with every step, until I broke through the tree line. I was in a clearing, and in the middle of it was a small cabin. The light was coming from a window, warm and inviting. I didn't stop to think about why a cabin would be out here, in the middle of nowhere. I just ran toward it, my feet slipping on the wet grass. I pounded on the door, my hands shaking, and it opened almost immediately. A man stood there, tall and broad-shouldered, with a beard that covered most of his face. He didn't say anything, just stepped aside to let me in. The cabin was small, just one room with a wood stove in the corner and a bed against the wall. It was warm, though, and the air smelled like wood smoke and coffee. I collapsed into a chair by the stove, my whole body trembling. The man didn't ask any questions. He just handed me a blanket and a mug of something hot. I wrapped the blanket around my shoulders and sipped the drink. It was coffee, strong and bitter, but it warmed me from the inside out. I sat there for a long time, just staring into the fire, trying to make sense of what had happened. Eventually, the man spoke. His voice was low and rough, like he didn't use it much. "You're lucky," he said. "Not many people find their way out of those woods." I looked at him, but he was staring into the fire, his face unreadable. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. He didn't look at me. "Those woods, they're not right. They've been here longer than anyone can remember, and they don't like people. They'll lead you in circles, make you see things that aren't there. Most folks who get lost in there, they don't come back." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I didn't say anything. I just sat there, sipping my coffee and staring into the fire. The man didn't say anything else, and neither did I. We just sat there in silence until the fire burned down to embers and the first light of dawn started to creep through the windows. When the sun was fully up, the man walked me to the edge of the clearing and pointed me toward the road. I didn't ask how he knew where I needed to go, and he didn't offer an explanation. I just thanked him and started walking. The road was only a mile away, and from there it was an easy walk back to my car. I didn't tell anyone about what happened that night. I knew they wouldn't believe me, and I didn't want to think about it too much myself. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I think about those woods. I think about the way the trees seemed to close in around me, the way the trail disappeared like it had never been there. And I wonder if I really did find my way out, or if the woods let me go. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the trail as I tightened the straps on my backpack. I had been planning this hike for weeks, a solo trek through the dense woods of the Black Ridge National Park. The map promised a challenging but rewarding route, with a stunning overlook at the end. I had told myself this would be a chance to clear my head, to get away from the noise of the city and the constant buzz of my phone. But as I stood at the trailhead, staring into the darkening forest, I felt a small knot of unease tighten in my stomach. I shook it off. This was what I wanted: solitude, nature, adventure. The first mile was easy. The trail was well marked, and the air was cool and crisp. The sound of my boots crunching on the gravel path was steady and reassuring. Birds chirped in the distance, and the occasional rustle of leaves reminded me that I wasn't entirely alone. I passed a couple of hikers on their way back to the parking lot, exchanging nods and brief smiles. They looked tired but content, their faces flushed from the exertion. I wondered if I'd look the same when I returned. By the time I reached the 2nd-mile marker, the sun had fully set, and the forest was bathed in a deep, almost oppressive darkness. I switched on my headlamp, the beam cutting through the blackness like a knife. The trail narrowed here, the trees pressing in on either side. The air felt heavier, damp and cold, and the sounds of the forest seemed to grow quieter, as if the woods were holding their breath. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the night always felt different in the wilderness. But the knot in my stomach was back, tighter this time. I kept walking, my pace steady but slower now. The trail began to climb, the incline sharp and unrelenting. My legs burned, and my breath came in short, ragged bursts. I focused on the beam of my headlamp, on the small circle of light it cast on the ground in front of me. The darkness beyond that light felt vast and endless, like I was walking through a void. I tried to shake the feeling, to remind myself that I was still on the trail, that I was still safe. But the further I went, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. It was around the 3rd mile that I first noticed the sound. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible, a soft, rhythmic crunching, like footsteps. I stopped, my heart pounding in my chest, and listened. The sound stopped too. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer or a raccoon, something harmless. But when I started walking again, the sound came back, matching my pace exactly. I stopped again, and again the sound stopped. My mouth went dry, and I could feel the sweat trickling down my back despite the cold. I told myself to stay calm, to keep moving. Maybe it was just an echo, or the sound of my own footsteps bouncing off the trees. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I picked up my pace, my boots slamming against the ground with more force than necessary. The sound kept up with me, never getting closer, but never falling behind either. My breath came faster now, my chest heaving as I pushed myself to move quicker. The trail was steep here, the rocks loose and slippery underfoot. I stumbled once, catching myself on a tree trunk, the bark rough and cold against my palm. I didn't stop, couldn't stop. The sound was still there, still following me. By the time I reached the 4th mile, I was running. My legs screamed in protest, my lungs burning with the effort, but I didn't care. The sound was louder now, closer. I could hear it clearly. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, my headlamp bouncing wildly as I sprinted up the trail. The beam of light caught glimpses of the forest around me. Gnarled tree roots, jagged rocks, the occasional flash of a reflective trail marker. But mostly, there was just darkness, endless and suffocating. I don't know how long I ran. Felt like hours, but it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. My legs gave out eventually, and I collapsed against a tree, gasping for air. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and my vision swam with spots of light. I forced myself to breathe, to listen. The sound was gone. The forest was silent again, except for the sound of my own ragged breathing. I slumped against the tree, my legs trembling, and tried to calm down. Maybe it had been an animal after all. Maybe I had just panicked for no reason. But as I sat there, trying to catch my breath, I noticed something else. The air smelled different, sharp and metallic, like blood. I frowned, sniffing the air. The smell was faint, but it was there, unmistakable. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs still shaky, and shone my headlamp around. The beam of light caught something on the ground a few feet away, something dark and wet. I took a step closer, my stomach churning. It was blood, fresh and glistening in the light. My heart skipped a beat, and I took a step back, my mind racing. What the hell had happened here? I didn't want to stay and find out. I turned and started walking again, my pace quick but controlled. The trail was even narrower here, the trees so close together that their branches intertwined overhead, blocking out the sky. The air felt thicker, heavier, and the smell of blood seemed to follow me, clinging to the back of my throat. I tried to focus on the trail, on the beam of my headlamp, but my mind kept wandering back to the blood, to the footsteps, to the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was around the 5th mile that I saw the first sign of civilization. A small wooden cabin, barely visible through the trees. My heart leapt at the sight of it. Maybe there was someone there, someone who could help me. I quickened my pace, my boots crunching on the gravel as I approached the cabin. It was old, the wood weathered and gray, and the windows were dark. There was no smoke coming from the chimney, no signs of life, but it was better than nothing. I knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the silent forest. There was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time, and called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" My voice sounded small and weak, swallowed by the vastness of the woods. Still no answer. I tried the door, and to my surprise, it creaked open. The inside of the cabin was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of mildew. I shone my headlamp around, the beam of light revealing a small, sparsely furnished room. There was a table, a chair, and a cot in the corner, but no sign of anyone living there. I stepped inside, my heart still pounding. The cabin felt safer than the forest, at least for now. I closed the door behind me, the wood groaning as it swung shut. The sound was loud in the silence, and I flinched. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, and sat down on the cot. My legs were still trembling, and my head was spinning. I needed to think, to figure out what to do next. But my mind was a jumble of fear and confusion, and I couldn't focus. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the wall, but eventually, I realized that the smell of blood was gone. The air in the cabin was stale and musty, but it didn't have that sharp, metallic tang anymore. I frowned, sniffing the air again. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the whole thing had been in my head. But the blood on the trail had been real, hadn't it? Couldn't be sure anymore. I stood up, my legs still shaky, and walked over to the window. The glass was grimy, covered in a thick layer of dust, but I could just make out the outline of the forest outside. It was still dark, the trees looming like silent sentinels. I felt a pang of unease, but I pushed it down. I couldn't stay here forever. I had to keep moving to get to the overlook and then back to the trailhead. The sooner I got out of these woods, the better. I opened the door and stepped back out into the night. The air was cold and damp, and the forest was silent. Too silent. I shone my headlamp around, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The trail was still there, just a few feet away, and I started walking again, my pace quick but steady. The smell of blood was gone, and the sound of footsteps was gone, but the knot in my stomach was still there, tight and unrelenting. The trail began to climb again, the incline steep and unrelenting. My legs burned with the effort, but I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees pressing in on either side, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The beam of my headlamp was the only thing keeping me grounded, the only thing keeping me from getting lost in the darkness. I focused on it, on the small circle of light it cast on the ground in front of me, and kept walking. It was around the 6th mile that I saw the first sign of the overlook, a wooden signpost, barely visible through the trees. My heart leapt at the sight of it. I was almost there. I quickened my pace, my boots slamming against the ground as I pushed myself to move faster. The sun was already low in the sky when I decided to take the trail. I'd been driving for hours, my mind buzzing with the need to get out of the car, to stretch my legs, to feel the earth beneath my boots. The map on my phone showed a short loop, maybe 2 hours tops, and I figured I'd be back before dark. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Why would I? It was just a hike, just a quick escape. The trailhead was unmarked, just a narrow gap in the trees with a faint path worn into the dirt. I parked my car on the side of the road, grabbed my backpack, and headed in. The air was cool, the kind of cool that makes you feel alive, and the scent of pine needles filled my nose. The forest was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like it's pressing down on you. But I didn't think much of it. I was too busy enjoying the crunch of leaves under my feet, the way the sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. The first mile was easy. The trail was clear, winding through the woods, up and down small hills, crossing a shallow stream. I stopped to take a few pictures, to breathe in the fresh air. But as I went deeper, the trail started to change. The path became narrower, the trees thicker. The sunlight didn't reach the ground here, and the air felt colder. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. No big deal, I thought. I'll just keep going. The loop should bring me back around soon. But it didn't. The trail kept going, deeper and deeper into the woods. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches twisting together overhead, blocking out the sky. The ground was uneven, roots snaking across the path, rocks jutting out at odd angles. I stumbled a few times, my boots slipping on the damp leaves. My heart started to beat a little faster, but I told myself it was just the exertion, just the climb. Then I saw it, a pile of rocks, stacked in a way that didn't look natural. They were too neat, too deliberate. I stopped, staring at them, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My mind raced, trying to remember if I'd read anything about cairns on this trail. But I couldn't think of anything. I shook my head, told myself it was nothing, and kept going. The trail got steeper, the trees thicker. The air felt heavier, harder to breathe. I started to notice things. Small things at first, a broken branch here, a scrap of fabric there. Then I saw the footprints. They were faint, barely visible in the dirt, but they were there, and they weren't mine. My heart skipped a beat. I told myself it was probably just another hiker, someone who'd come through earlier. But the footprints were fresh, the edges still sharp. Someone had been here recently. I kept walking, my eyes darting around, scanning the trees, the ground, the shadows. The forest felt different now, darker, more menacing. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own breathing, the crunch of my boots on the dirt. I tried to shake the feeling, to tell myself I was being paranoid. But the unease was growing, spreading through me like a cold, creeping fog. Then I heard it, a sound, faint but unmistakable. A twig snapping somewhere behind me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I listened, straining to hear over the rush of blood in my ears. There it was again, closer this time. I turned, slowly, my eyes scanning the trees. But I saw nothing, just shadows, just branches swaying in the wind. I told myself it was an animal, a deer or a raccoon. But the sound came again, louder this time, and I knew it wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too purposeful. I started walking faster, my boots slamming into the ground, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The trail was barely visible now, just a faint line in the dirt, and I had to focus to keep from losing it. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like claws. The air was thick, heavy, and I could feel the sweat dripping down my back, soaking into my shirt. My heart was racing, my mind spinning, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the shadows just off the trail. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. My eyes locked onto it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was tall, too tall, and its shape was wrong, distorted. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, rooted to the spot, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The figure moved, stepping out of the shadows, and I saw it clearly for the first time. It was a man, but he wasn't right. His clothes were torn, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. He looked like he hadn't eaten in weeks, like he hadn't slept in months. And he was staring at me, his eyes burning with the intensity that made my skin crawl. I turned and ran, my boots slamming into the ground, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The trail was a blur, the trees a wall of green and brown, and I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps pounding into the dirt, his breath rasping in his throat. I didn't look back. I couldn't look back. I just ran. The trail twisted and turned, the trees closing in around me, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest, threatening to overwhelm me. My legs were burning, my lungs screaming for air, but I didn't stop, couldn't stop. I could hear him getting closer, his footsteps louder, his breath heavier, and I knew I wasn't going to make it. I wasn't going to get away. Then I saw it, a break in the trees, a patch of sunlight. I pushed myself harder, my legs screaming in protest, my vision blurring. The light grew brighter, the trees thinner, and then I was out, stumbling into a clearing. I fell to my knees, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around, my eyes scanning the trees, but there was no sign of him. He was gone. I sat there for what felt like hours, my body shaking, my mind racing. The sun was setting, the sky turning orange and pink, and I knew I had to get out of there. I stood up, my legs still trembling, and started walking. The trail was clearer now, the trees thinner, and I could see the road in the distance. My car was still there, just where I'd left it, and I felt a surge of relief as I climbed in and started the engine. I drove away as fast as I could, my hands gripping the wheel, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror. The forest was a blur of green and brown, and I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if he was still there, if he was watching me. I just wanted to get away, to put as much distance between me and that place as I could. When I got home, I locked the doors and drew the curtains. I didn't sleep that night, couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, his hollow eyes, his gaunt face. I could still hear his footsteps, his breath, and I knew I'd never forget it. I'd never forget him. The next day, I went to the police. I told them everything, showed them the pictures I'd taken, the map on my phone. They listened, they nodded, but I could see it in their eyes. They didn't believe me. They thought I was crazy, that I'd imagined the whole thing. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew he was real. I never went back to that trail. I never even drove past it. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the shadows are long, I think about him. I think about what he wanted, why he was there, and I wonder if he's still out there, waiting, watching. I wonder if he's waiting for me. The sun was already dipping low in the sky when I decided to take the trail. I'd been planning this hike for weeks, but life had gotten in the way. Work, errands, the usual grind. Today, though, I'd finally carved out the time. The trail was one I'd never done before, a narrow path that wound through dense woods and up into the hills. It was supposed to be challenging, but not too bad for someone like me who hikes regularly. I'd packed light: a water bottle, a few energy bars, a flashlight, and a small first aid kit. I didn't think I'd need much else. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, with a light breeze that carried the scent of pine and damp earth. I parked my car at the trailhead, locked it, and slung my backpack over my shoulders. The trail stretched out ahead of me, disappearing into the trees. I took a deep breath and started walking. The first mile was easy. The trail was well marked, with clear signs pointing the way. The forest was quiet. The only sounds the crunch of my boots on the dirt path and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The trees were tall and thick, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the ground. I felt good, strong. The air was fresh, and the solitude was exactly what I needed. I'd been feeling cooped up lately, stuck in the same routine day after day. This was my chance to clear my head, to feel alive. But as I walked deeper into the woods, the trail began to change. The markers became less frequent, and the path grew narrower, more overgrown. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches twisting and tangling together. The sunlight faded, replaced by a dim, grayish light that made everything look shadowy and indistinct. I checked my phone for the trail map, but there was no signal. I hadn't expected that. I told myself it was fine. I'd just keep following the trail. It had to lead somewhere. The further I went, the more uneasy I felt. The woods were too quiet now, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, oppressive. Even the wind had died down, leaving the air still and thick. I kept walking, my boots crunching on the dry leaves and twigs that littered the path. My breathing sounded loud in the silence, and I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the deeper I went, the harder it was to ignore. I don't know how long I'd been walking when I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in a while. I stopped and looked around, trying to orient myself. The trees all looked the same, tall, dark, and endless. The path I was on seemed to be fading, swallowed up by the undergrowth. I felt a pang of panic but pushed it down. Couldn't be lost. I'd been following the trail, hadn't I? I turned around, thinking I'd just go back the way I'd come. But the path behind me looked different now, unfamiliar. The trees seemed closer together, the shadows deeper. I told myself I was just turned around, that I'd find my way if I kept moving. I kept walking, but the trail didn't get any clearer. If anything, it seemed to be disappearing altogether. The underbrush was thicker now, the ground uneven and rocky. My boots slipped on loose stones, and I had to grab onto tree branches to keep my balance. My arms and legs were scratched from pushing through the brambles, and my clothes were damp with sweat. I was breathing hard, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself to stay calm, to think clearly, but the panic was creeping in, tightening my chest and making it hard to breathe. I stopped again and tried to think. I couldn't just keep wandering aimlessly. I needed to find a way out. I looked up at the sky, hoping to see the sun, but the canopy was too thick. The light was fading fast, and I realized with a sinking feeling that it would be dark soon. I fumbled in my backpack for my flashlight, my hands shaking. I turned it on, but the beam was weak, barely cutting through the gloom. I cursed myself for not bringing extra batteries. I kept moving, forcing myself to put one foot in front of the other. The woods seemed to stretch on forever, an endless sea of trees and shadows. My legs were aching, and my throat was dry. I took a sip of water, but it didn't help much. I was starting to feel lightheaded. My thoughts jumbled and scattered. I tried to focus, to remember anything that could help me. Landmarks, the direction of the sun, anything, but my mind was blank. The darkness closed in around me, and the woods came alive with sounds. Twigs snapped, leaves rustled, and I could hear something moving in the underbrush. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer or a raccoon, but the sounds were too loud, too close. I swung the flashlight around, but the beam was too weak to see anything clearly. The shadows seemed to shift and move, and I felt like I was being watched. My skin prickled, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I wanted to run, but I didn't know where to go. The trail was gone, and I was completely disoriented. I don't know how long I wandered in the dark. Felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. My legs were like lead, and every step was a struggle. My mind was foggy, and I could barely think straight. I was so tired, so scared. I just wanted to lie down and close my eyes, but I knew I couldn't. If I stopped, I might never get up again. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I saw it, a light. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a trick of the darkness. But it was there, faint but steady, through the trees. I stumbled toward it, my heart racing. The light grew brighter as I got closer, and I could see that it was coming from a small cabin. Relief flooded through me, so strong it made my knees weak. I wasn't going to die out here after all. I reached the cabin and pounded on the door, my hands shaking. There was no answer. I tried the handle, and to my surprise, it was unlocked. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cabin was small and sparsely furnished, but it was warm and dry. There was a fireplace with a few embers still glowing, and a lantern on the table cast a soft, golden light. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. I didn't know who the cabin belonged to, but I didn't care. I was just grateful to be out of the woods. I sat down at the table and put my head in my hands, trying to calm down. My heart was still racing, and my hands were trembling. I took a few deep breaths, forcing myself to relax. I was safe now. I could figure out what to do next. I looked around the cabin, taking in the details. There was a bed in one corner, neatly made with a patchwork quilt. A small kitchen area had a sink, a stove, and a few shelves with canned goods and dishes. There was a bookshelf with a handful of books, and a coat rack by the door with a few jackets hanging on it. It looked like someone lived here, but there was no sign of them now. I got up and went to the kitchen, looking for something to drink. There was a pitcher of water on the counter, and I poured myself a glass. It was cool and clear, and it tasted better than anything I'd ever had. I drank it down in one go and poured myself another. My throat felt less dry, and my head was starting to clear. I sat back down at the table and tried to think. I needed to figure out where I was and how to get back to my car. I didn't have my phone, and even if I did, there was no signal out here. I'd have to wait until morning and try to find my way back. For now, I was safe. That was all that mattered. I got up and went to the bed, pulling back the quilt. The sheets were clean and smelled faintly of lavender. I lay down, my body sinking into the soft mattress. I was so tired, so exhausted. My eyes closed almost immediately, and I felt myself drifting off to sleep. But just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard it, a sound outside the cabin. It was faint, but unmistakable. Footsteps. My eyes snapped open, and I sat up, my heart pounding. I listened, holding my breath. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, crunching on the gravel outside. They stopped, and then there was a knock on the door. I froze, my mind racing. Who could it be? The owner of the cabin? Someone else who was lost? Or something else entirely? I didn't know what to do. My instincts told me to stay quiet, to pretend I wasn't here. But what if it was someone who could help me? The knock came again, louder this time. I got up and went to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob. I didn't know what to do. I took a deep breath and opened the door. There was no one there. I stepped outside, looking around. The woods were dark and silent, the trees looming like shadows. The lantern light spilled out of the cabin, casting a small circle of light on the ground. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. The footsteps had been so clear, so real, but there was no one here. I went back inside and closed the door, my hands shaking. I locked it and leaned against it, trying to calm down. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined the footsteps? Was I so tired and scared? The sun was already low in the sky when I decided to take the trail. I'd been planning this hike for weeks, but life kept getting in the way. Work, errands, excuses. Today, though, I finally had the time. The trail was supposed to be a simple loop, about 5 miles through the woods, with a few steep climbs but nothing too challenging. I'd done my research, packed my bag with water, snacks, a flashlight, and a first aid kit. I even checked the weather, clear skies, no rain. Perfect conditions, or so I thought. The trailhead was easy to find, marked by a wooden sign with faded letters. I parked my car, locked it, and slung my backpack over my shoulders. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that bites at your nose but feels refreshing after being cooped up indoors. I took a deep breath, savoring the scent of pine and damp earth, and started walking. The first mile was uneventful. The trail was well maintained, the ground packed hard from countless footsteps. Birds chirped in the trees, and the occasional rustle of leaves made me glance over my shoulder. But it was always just a squirrel or a breeze. I felt good, strong, like I could walk forever. The rhythm of my boots hitting the dirt was soothing, almost meditative. But as I went deeper into the woods, the trail began to change. The trees grew thicker, their branches twisting together to form a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air felt heavier, damp, and the sounds of birds faded until all I could hear was the crunch of my own footsteps. I checked my map, but it didn't show any forks or alternate paths. I was on the right trail, but it didn't feel right. The ground started to slope upward, and the trail became rougher, littered with rocks and roots that seemed to reach out to trip me. My legs burned with the effort, and my breath came in short, sharp bursts. I stopped to take a sip of water, and that's when I noticed the silence. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just silence. I shook it off. It was just the woods, I told myself. Woods were supposed to be quiet. I kept walking, but the unease in my gut grew with every step. The trees seemed closer together, their trunks gnarled and twisted like they were alive. Shadows stretched across the trail, long and dark, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often, though I couldn't say why. The trail narrowed until it was little more than a thin strip of dirt winding through the underbrush. Branches clawed at my arms and face, leaving thin scratches that stung in the cold air. I pushed through, telling myself it was just a rough patch, that the trail would open up again soon. But it didn't. If anything, it got worse. The sun was almost gone now, the sky a deep, bruised purple. I pulled out my flashlight and turned it on, the beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. The light made the shadows worse, though, stretching them into strange, menacing shapes that seemed to move when I wasn't looking. My heart was pounding now, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I told myself it was just the exertion, the climb, but I knew that wasn't true. I stopped to check my map again, but the paper was damp from the sweat on my hands, the lines blurring together. I couldn't make sense of it. I tried to remember how far I'd come, how much farther I had to go, but my mind was blank. Panic bubbled up in my chest, hot and sharp, and I forced it down. I wasn't lost, couldn't be lost. I just had to keep going. The trail disappeared. 1 minute it was there, a thin strip of dirt beneath my feet, and the next it was gone, swallowed by the underbrush. I spun around, shining my flashlight in every direction, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows and more trees. My heart was racing now, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the flashlight. I tried to retrace my steps, but everything looked the same. The trees, the shadows, the endless, suffocating silence. I don't know how long I wandered. Time lost all meaning in the darkness. My legs ached, my throat was dry, and my head throbbed with every step. I kept telling myself I'd find the trail again, that I'd see a marker or a sign, but there was nothing, just the endless, oppressive forest. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow playing on my exhausted mind. But as I got closer, I realized it was real. A cabin, small and weathered, its wooden walls warped and cracked with age. The roof sagged in the middle and the windows were dark, but there was smoke curling from the chimney. My heart leapt. Someone was here. Someone could help me. I stumbled toward the cabin, my legs barely holding me up. The door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. The inside was dim, lit only by the flickering light of a fire in the hearth. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and something else, something metallic and sharp. "Hello," I called, my voice hoarse and shaky. There was no answer. I stepped inside, my boots echoing on the wooden floor. The cabin was small, just one room with a table, a chair, and a bed in the corner. The walls were bare, the wood stained and cracked. The fire crackled in the hearth, but there was no one there, no one to have lit it. My skin prickled with unease, but I was too tired to care. I dropped my backpack on the floor and sank into the chair, my legs trembling with relief. The heat from the fire felt good, soothing the ache in my muscles. I closed my eyes, just for a moment, and let myself relax. That's when I heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from outside the cabin. My eyes snapped open, and I sat up straight, my heart pounding. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then they started again, closer this time. I stood up, my legs shaking, and grabbed my flashlight. The beam was weak, the batteries almost dead, but it was better than nothing. I crept toward the door, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The footsteps were right outside now, just beyond the door. I could hear the crunch of leaves, the creak of wood as someone, or something, stepped onto the porch. I reached for the door, my hand trembling, and pulled it open. There was no one there. The porch was empty, the woods beyond dark and silent. I shone the flashlight around, but there was nothing. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. Just the endless, oppressive forest. I stepped back inside, my heart racing, and closed the door behind me. I leaned against it, trying to calm my breathing, but the unease in my gut wouldn't go away. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. I turned back to the fire, and that's when I saw it. On the table, where there had been nothing before, was a knife. It was old, the blade rusted and pitted, but the edge was sharp. My stomach churned, and I took a step back, my mind racing. Where had it come from? Who had put it there? The fire crackled, and I realized the room was getting colder. The warmth from the hearth was fading, the flames shrinking until they were little more than embers. I grabbed my backpack and slung it over my shoulders, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fasten the straps. I had to get out of here. Now, I turned toward the door, but it was gone. Where the door had been, there was now just a solid wall of wood. The planks warped and cracked like the rest of the cabin. I spun around, shining my flashlight around the room, but there were no windows, no other doors. Just the four walls, the table, the chair, and the bed. And the knife. I backed away from the table, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was freezing now, my breath coming out in white puffs. The fire was almost out, the embers glowing faintly in the darkness. I shone the flashlight around the room again, desperate for a way out, but there was nothing, just the walls closing in around me. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in fear. Time seemed to stretch and warp, the darkness pressing down on me like a physical weight. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but there was no sense to be made. This wasn't possible. None of this was possible. And then I heard it again. The footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from inside the cabin. I spun around, shining the flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing. Just the empty room, the walls closing in. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then they started again, closer this time. I backed away until I hit the wall, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The footsteps were right in front of me now, but there was no one there. Just the empty room, the darkness, and the knife on the table. The flashlight flickered, the beam growing weaker, and I realized the batteries were almost dead. I shook it, trying to keep the light on, but it was no use. The beam dimmed, then went out, plunging the room into darkness. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps were... The sun was just starting to rise when I parked my truck at the trailhead. The air was crisp, the kind that makes your breath visible but isn't uncomfortably cold. The plan was simple, an overnight solo hike along a remote trail I had read about online. It wasn't well known, which was perfect. I wanted solitude, peace, and the challenge of being completely alone in the wilderness. I strapped on my pack, double-checked my gear, map, compass, extra layers, enough food for 2 days, a good amount of water, my knife, and a small emergency kit. I even had my satellite communicator just in case. I wasn't new to hiking alone. I had done it plenty of times before, but something about this trip felt different. Maybe it was the unfamiliarity of the trail or the sheer distance I was planning to cover in just 2 days. But I pushed that feeling down. I was prepared. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail cut through thick forest, pine needles softening my footsteps. The silence was soothing, only broken by the occasional rustling in the underbrush and the distant calls of birds. I made good time, stopping briefly to check my map and take a few sips of water. The trail was rougher than I expected. Narrow in some places, rocky in others, but nothing I couldn't handle. As midday approached, I reached a clearing that overlooked a valley. I took a break there, eating a protein bar and letting my legs rest. That's when I noticed something odd. A single boot, half buried in the dirt near the edge of the clearing. It was old, the leather cracked, the laces frayed. At first, I thought nothing of it. People lost gear all the time. Maybe someone had dropped it years ago. But as I got closer, I saw that the inside of the boot was stuffed with something. A rolled-up piece of cloth, almost like a sock. I didn't touch it. Something about it felt off. Instead, I took a picture with my phone and continued hiking. The further I went, the more uneasy I became. The trail was supposed to be marked, but I wasn't seeing the blazes as often as I should have. I double-checked my map and compass. Everything seemed right, but the landscape didn't match what I had expected. It was denser, the trees closer together, the path harder to follow. Then I saw the second boot. This one was newer, less worn. It was sitting right in the middle of the trail, as if someone had placed it there intentionally. My stomach tightened. Something was wrong. I picked up my pace, pushing forward, telling myself I was overthinking things. Maybe a careless hiker had lost both boots on separate occasions. It was a strange coincidence, but not impossible. An hour later, I found the backpack. It was torn, the straps shredded, the main compartment half-zipped, revealing a few scattered supplies. An empty water bottle, a crushed energy bar wrapper, a tattered map. No sign of the owner. At this point, my instincts were screaming at me to turn back. But I was miles in, and retracing my steps would take hours. According to my map, there was a small stream not far ahead. I decided to push on, refill my water, and reassess. When I reached the stream, the water was clear, moving fast over smooth rocks. I crouched down to fill my bottle when I saw something just a few feet upstream. Fabric caught on a branch, fluttering slightly in the breeze. It was a piece of a shirt, torn and stained dark with something I didn't want to think about. That was it. I was done. I capped my bottle, slung my pack over my shoulders, and turned back the way I came. I moved quickly but carefully, listening for anything unusual. The forest felt different now, like it was watching me. Every snapped twig made my heart hammer in my chest. I passed the spot where I had found the backpack, then the second boot, then the first. I was making good time, but as I reached the clearing again, I saw something that made my blood go cold. There was a figure standing at the far edge of the clearing. Too far to make out details, but close enough that I could see they were watching me. I didn't hesitate. I moved, fast, forcing myself not to break into a full sprint, knowing that running blindly would only put me in more danger. The figure didn't move. They just stood there. By the time I reached my truck, my legs were shaking. I threw my pack into the passenger seat, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled away from the trailhead, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure was gone. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. I checked my phone. No service until I was deep into civilization. When I finally got a signal, I looked at the picture I had taken of the boot. Something in my gut told me to report it, so I did. I called the local ranger station, told them what I had found, sent them the picture, gave them the coordinates. A week later, I got a call back. They had searched the area and found nothing. No boots, no backpack, no torn clothing. But they did find something else. A makeshift camp, not far from the trail. Empty, abandoned. And near the fire pit, a row of boots, all different sizes, lined up neatly, facing the trail. I haven't hiked alone since. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon as I tightened the straps on my backpack and took my first steps onto the trail. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that bites at your nose and makes your breath visible in little puffs. I had been planning this hike for weeks, a solo trek through the dense woods of the Black Ridge Mountains. It was supposed to be a chance to clear my head, to get away from the noise of the city and the constant buzz of my phone. But as I walked deeper into the forest, the trees closing in around me like silent sentinels, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The trail was well marked, or at least it had been at the start. Bright yellow blazes painted on the trees guided my way, but as the light faded, they became harder to see. I pulled out my headlamp and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the growing darkness. The forest was alive with sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. But there was another sound, one that didn't belong. It was faint at first, almost like the wind, but it grew louder the further I went. A low, rhythmic thumping, like the beat of a drum, but slower, more deliberate. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination, but it was there, always just at the edge of my hearing. The trail began to narrow, the trees pressing in closer on either side. The underbrush was thick, tangling around my boots as I pushed forward. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, the cold air burning my lungs. I could feel the weight of my backpack digging into my shoulders, the straps cutting into my skin. I thought about stopping, setting up camp for the night, but something kept me moving. The thumping sound was louder now, more insistent, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, the beam of my headlamp sweeping across the trees. Nothing, just shadows and the endless stretch of forest. But the feeling didn't go away. It clung to me like a second skin, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck that made me want to run. I forced myself to keep walking, one foot in front of the other, my eyes fixed on the trail ahead. The thumping sound was almost deafening now, a steady, pounding rhythm that seemed to come from all around me. I could feel it in my chest, vibrating through my bones. My heart was racing, my palms slick with sweat despite the cold. I wanted to turn back, to retrace my steps and get out of there as fast as I could, but I knew I was too far in. The trail behind me was just as dark and foreboding as the path ahead. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by my headlamp. But as I got closer, I realized it was something else. A figure standing just off the trail, partially hidden by the trees. It was tall, too tall to be human, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch out in all directions. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and it was completely still, like a statue carved from ice. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The thumping sound was coming from it, a deep, resonant pulse that seemed to echo through the forest. I wanted to scream, to turn and run, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were rooted to the ground, my body refusing to obey the frantic commands of my brain. The figure didn't move either, just stood there, watching me with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. I could feel its gaze on me, cold and unblinking, and I knew that it was waiting for something. I don't know how long I stood there, locked in that silent, staring contest, but eventually, I managed to break free. I turned and ran, my boots pounding against the dirt as I sprinted down the trail. The thumping sound followed me, growing louder and more intense with every step. I could feel it in my chest, a relentless, pounding rhythm that made it hard to breathe. I didn't look back, didn't dare to. I just ran, my heart hammering in my chest, my lungs burning with the effort. The trail seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning through the trees, but I didn't stop, couldn't. I could still feel the figure behind me, its presence like a weight pressing down on my shoulders. I didn't know if it was following me, if it was even real, but I wasn't going to take the chance. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing onto the ground in a heap. I lay there, gasping for air, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. When I finally looked up, I realized I was back at the start of the trail. The parking lot was just ahead, the dim glow of a streetlight cutting through the darkness. I could see my car, sitting alone in the empty lot, and I almost cried with relief. I dragged myself to my feet, my legs shaking, and stumbled towards the car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling so badly that it took me 3 tries to get the door open. I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. I sat there for a long time, just breathing, trying to calm my racing heart. The thumping sound was gone, replaced by the quiet hum of the engine as I started the car. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing there, watching me, but there was nothing, just the empty parking lot and the dark outline of the trees. I drove home in silence, my mind racing with questions. What had I seen? Was it real, or just a figment of my imagination, brought on by exhaustion and fear? I didn't know, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. All I knew was that I wasn't going back to those woods. Not ever. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. I reached for it, my hand still shaking slightly, and saw that I had a missed call from an unknown number. There was a voicemail too, and I hesitated for a moment before pressing play. The voice on the other end was deep and gravelly, with a strange, almost mechanical quality to it. "You shouldn't have come back," it said. "You shouldn't have come back." I stared at the phone, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was familiar, but I couldn't place it. And then it hit me. It was the same voice I had heard in the woods, the same low, rhythmic thumping that had followed me through the trees. I dropped the phone like it was on fire, my hands trembling uncontrollably. I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That I had seen something in the woods, something that wasn't human? They would think I was crazy, and maybe I was. Maybe the whole thing had been in my head, a hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I had seen something real, and it had followed me home. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, jumping at every sound, every shadow. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the figure from the woods was still out there, waiting for me. I tried to distract myself, to focus on anything else, but it was no use. The memory of those glowing eyes, that cold, unblinking gaze, was burned into my mind. As the days turned into weeks, I started to think that maybe I was safe. Maybe whatever I had seen in the woods had decided to leave me alone. But then one night, as I was lying in bed, I heard it again. The thumping sound, low and rhythmic, coming from outside my window. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, and slowly turned my head to look. There, standing in the shadows just beyond the glass, was the figure. It was taller than I remembered, its limbs even more elongated, its skin almost glowing in the moonlight. It was watching me, those same cold, unblinking eyes fixed on mine. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in that same staring contest I had been in the woods. The figure didn't move either, just stood there, watching me, the thumping sound growing louder and more intense. I could feel it in my chest, a relentless, pounding rhythm that made it hard to breathe. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The thumping sound stopped, and the figure vanished into the shadows. I lay there for a long time, my heart racing, my body trembling with fear. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't call the police, couldn't tell anyone what I had seen. They would think I was crazy, and maybe I was, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't safe. Not here, not anywhere. The next morning, I packed a bag and left. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to get away. I drove for hours, putting as much distance between myself and that place as I could. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that the figure from the woods was still out there, watching me, waiting for me. I don't know how long I'll be able to keep running, how long I'll be able to stay ahead of whatever it is that's chasing me. But I do know one thing: I'm not going back, not ever, because whatever that thing was, whatever it wanted from me, I don't want to find out. I just want to be left alone. But deep down, I know that's not going to happen. The figure is still out there, waiting, watching. And one day, it's going to find me. And when it does, I don't know what will happen. But I do know one thing: I'm not going down. I decided to go hiking alone that weekend. I had always been the kind of person who enjoyed the solitude of the wilderness, the quiet hum of nature replacing the constant noise of everyday life. I picked a trail that wasn't well known, one that I found online after hours of digging through hiking forums. It was remote, difficult, and had barely any reviews. Exactly what I was looking for. I left early in the morning, my backpack stuffed with supplies, water, protein bars, a first aid kit, and a small knife I always carried when hiking. The drive to the trailhead took longer than expected, and by the time I got there, the sun was already well above the horizon. I parked my car at the entrance, locked it, and slung my backpack over my shoulders. The first few miles were uneventful. The trees were dense, thick canopies of green blocking out most of the sky. The ground was uneven, roots and rocks jutting out unpredictably, but I moved carefully. The air smelled fresh, untouched, like only nature could. It was the kind of silence I loved, the kind that made me feel like I was the only person left in the world. As I got deeper into the forest, the trail became less defined. I followed my map, using a compass to make sure I was going the right way. I had planned for this, knowing that the trail was barely maintained. I was ready for the challenge. After about 4 hours of hiking, I stopped to eat. I found a flat rock near a stream and sat down, listening to the soft trickle of water as I unwrapped a protein bar. The quiet was calming, almost too calming. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, just stillness. It felt off. I shook the feeling away and kept moving. The farther I went, the less familiar the trail felt. The trees seemed closer together, the air thicker, more humid. I wiped sweat from my forehead and checked my GPS. I was still on track, but something didn't feel right. It was that deep, gut-level discomfort, the kind you can't explain. Another hour passed, and the trail narrowed even more. I had to push through branches, step over fallen logs. I was sure no one had been through here in a long time. I started noticing small things I shouldn't have ignored. The first was a broken tree branch, freshly snapped. Not unusual, but it was angled downward, almost like something heavy had been hanging from it. Then I saw footprints. They weren't mine. They were large, deep imprints in the dirt. I crouched down to get a better look. They looked fresh, and they weren't from boots, they were barefoot. A chill ran down my spine. I stood up quickly, suddenly hyper-aware of how alone I was. I told myself it could be anything. Maybe some other hiker had come through here, maybe a hunter. But as I kept walking, I noticed more. Broken branches, disturbed patches of dirt, deep scratches in tree trunks. And then I smelled it. Rot. It was faint at first, but the deeper I went, the stronger it became. The unmistakable, sickly stench of decay. I covered my nose with my sleeve, forcing myself to breathe through my mouth. My instinct told me to turn around, but I had already come so far. That's when I heard it, a rustling in the bushes to my left. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't move. Something or someone was there. I stood completely still, barely breathing. My hand tightened around the strap of my backpack. I listened, waiting, then silence again. I forced myself to take a step forward, then another. The moment my foot pressed into the dirt, something snapped behind me. I turned so fast I nearly lost my balance. Nothing, just trees, shadows stretching long in the afternoon light. I swallowed hard and started walking faster. My goal was to reach a small clearing up ahead where I had planned to set up camp. I just needed to get there. Every step felt heavier, like the weight of the forest was pressing down on me. The smell of rot followed me, clinging to the air. I reached the clearing just as the sun began to dip. It was small, barely large enough for my one-person tent. I set up quickly, trying to shake the unease from my body. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing things. Footsteps, the occasional snap of a branch, a faint breathing sound just outside my tent. Every time I unzipped the flap and looked, there was nothing, just darkness, stretching endlessly in all directions. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. When I woke up, something was wrong. The air felt heavier, thick with a dampness that hadn't been there the night before. I sat up and reached for my pack. It was gone. I scrambled out of my tent, my eyes scanning the clearing. My pack had been right next to me. Now it was gone. My stomach dropped. Someone had been here. I looked around, heart pounding. That's when I saw it. A single, deep footprint near my tent. Barefoot. I didn't think. I just ran. I left everything, my tent, my sleeping bag, my supplies. I didn't care. I sprinted back toward the direction I came, barely watching where I stepped. My only goal was to get out. The forest felt different now. The trees seemed closer together, the light barely breaking through. I could hear something behind me, quick, heavy steps. I ran faster. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, and then the smell hit me again. Stronger this time, overwhelming. I gagged but didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just ran. Somehow I made it back to my car. I don't remember the last stretch of the trail. My mind had gone blank, my body running on pure instinct. I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and started the engine with shaking hands. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I never went back, never checked the forums to see if anyone else had been there. I left everything behind. My gear, my pride, and something else. The feeling that I wasn't supposed to make it out. I had planned the hike for weeks. A solo trip into the woods, away from the noise of everyday life. The trail I chose was remote, far from popular routes, deep in a stretch of national forest where few ventured. It was supposed to be peaceful, a chance to clear my head. The morning started crisp and cool. My backpack was heavy with supplies, extra water, protein bars, a first aid kit, and a sturdy knife just in case. My boots were broken in, my gear tested. Everything felt right. I parked my car at a small pull-off along a narrow gravel road, double-checked my map, and stepped onto the trail. The first few miles were smooth. The path was narrow but well-defined, winding through thick trees. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting shifting patterns on the ground. Birds chirped, squirrels rustled in the undergrowth, and a faint breeze kept me cool. I was alone, but not lonely. The sounds of the forest filled the space around me. About 4 miles in, the terrain changed. The trees grew denser, the underbrush thicker. The trail, once a clear dirt path, became rocky and uneven. The incline was sharper than I'd expected, and I had to use my hands to steady myself as I climbed over loose stones. I felt the burn in my legs but welcomed it. Then, I noticed the silence. No birds, no rustling in the bushes, just my own breathing, the crunch of my boots, and the occasional creak of tree branches shifting in the wind. I paused, listening. The absence of sound made the forest feel wrong, like something was just out of sight, watching. I shook the feeling off. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. I kept walking. After another hour, I reached a small clearing. I checked my GPS. It showed I was still on course, but the signal flickered. No service. Not unusual this deep in the woods. I pulled out my paper map, tracing my planned route with a finger. I had another 6 miles to go before reaching the spot I planned to camp. I took a break, sitting on a fallen log to drink some water. The forest remained unnervingly quiet. I forced myself to focus on my breathing. I'd been on solo hikes before. I knew how easy it was to let fear creep in. There was nothing out there but trees and wildlife. I pressed on. The further I went, the worse the trail became. Overgrown sections forced me to push through thick brush, thorns scratching my arms. Fallen trees blocked the path, requiring detours. I started feeling uneasy. The map showed a maintained trail, but this looked like it hadn't been used in years. Then I found the boot print. It was fresh, pressed deep into the dirt, pointing in the same direction I was heading. Someone had come this way recently. The sight should have been comforting, proof that I wasn't alone out here. Instead, it made my stomach twist. I hadn't seen another car at the pull-off. Who else was hiking this far out? I kept moving, but the sense of being watched grew stronger. I glanced over my shoulder more than once, scanning the trees. Nothing. Still, I picked up my pace. An hour later, I reached a small stream and crouched to refill my bottle. That's when I saw it. Across the water, wedged between two rocks, was a torn backpack. It was filthy, covered in dirt and leaves. One strap was ripped clean off. I moved closer, stepping carefully on the slick stones. The pack was partially unzipped. Inside, I saw a few scattered supplies: an empty water bottle, a crushed granola bar, and a flashlight with cracked glass. No ID, no way to know who it belonged to. My first instinct was to turn back. Something was wrong, but I was miles from my car. If someone was hurt out here, they might need help. I scanned the area, looking for any sign of a person. Nothing, just trees and silence. I pulled out my map, trying to find the closest marked campsite. There was one about 3 miles ahead. If someone had lost their pack, they might have made it there. I decided to check it out. The trail grew harder to follow. At times, it vanished entirely, forcing me to rely on my compass. The light began to fade. I hadn't planned to hike this late, but I needed to see that campsite. Then I smelled it, something rotten. The stench hit me hard, thick, cloying, unmistakable. I covered my nose, scanning the area. A few yards off the trail, a pile of bones lay scattered in the leaves. Animal bones, I told myself. Probably a deer, but something had stripped them clean. I kept moving. When I finally reached the campsite, the sun was slipping behind the trees. The place was abandoned. An old fire pit, some scattered trash. No tent, no sign of anyone. I checked the ground for tracks. Someone had been here recently, maybe within the last day. Then I saw the knife. It was stuck in a tree at the edge of the clearing, buried deep in the wood. The handle was worn, the blade rusted. It didn't look like it had been there long. That was enough for me. I turned back, moving fast. The quiet of the forest now felt oppressive. My skin prickled. Every shadow looked like a person. Every snapped twig made my heart jump. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine. They were slow, deliberate, coming from behind me. I didn't turn around. I didn't stop. I walked faster, trying to keep my breathing steady. The footsteps quickened to match my pace. I broke into a run. Branches slapped against my arms and face. I stumbled, catching myself. The sound of footsteps followed, gaining. I veered off the trail, pushing through thick underbrush, trying to throw off whatever was behind me. My legs burned. My lungs screamed. Then silence. I stopped, gasping for breath. I listened. Nothing. I waited, heart pounding in my ears. A minute passed, then another. The forest was still. I forced myself to move again, slower this time, sticking to the shadows. I navigated by instinct, my map forgotten. I just needed to reach my car. Took hours. The darkness swallowed the forest, turning every tree into a looming figure. My legs ached. My hands were scratched raw, but I didn't stop. When I finally saw the glint of my car's headlights in the moonlight, relief nearly knocked me over. I sprinted the last stretch, yanked the door open, and locked it behind me. I sat there, shaking, staring into the trees, waiting to see if something or someone emerged. Nothing did. I started the engine and peeled out, gravel spraying behind me. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back on a paved road, surrounded by streetlights and other cars. I never went back. A week later, curiosity got the better of me. I searched for missing persons reports in the area. Nothing recent. No hikers gone missing. No news of strange findings in the woods. But I know what I heard, what I saw. Someone else was out there, and they didn't want me to leave. The sun was already low in the sky when I decided to take the trail. I'd been driving for hours, the kind of long, monotonous drive that makes your legs ache and your mind wander. I needed to stretch my legs, to feel the ground beneath my feet, to breathe in something other than the stale air of my car. The trailhead was unmarked, just a narrow break in the trees with a faint path leading into the woods. I didn't think much of it. I'd hiked plenty of trails before, some marked, some not. This one looked quiet, peaceful even. The kind of place where you could lose yourself for a little while and forget about the noise of the world. I grabbed my backpack from the trunk, the one I always kept ready for impromptu hikes. Water, a protein bar, a flashlight, a small first aid kit, and a pocket knife. I didn't plan on being out long, just an hour or so, enough to clear my head before getting back on the road. The air was cool, the kind of cool that makes you feel alive, and the trees swayed gently in the breeze. I took a deep breath and stepped onto the trail. The first few minutes were uneventful. The path was narrow but clear, winding through tall pines and patches of underbrush. The ground was soft beneath my boots, the kind of soft that comes from years of fallen leaves and pine needles. I could hear birds chirping in the distance, the occasional rustle of leaves as some small animal darted through the underbrush. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that makes you forget about everything else. But as I walked deeper into the woods, the trail began to change. The trees grew thicker, their branches intertwining overhead and blocking out the sun. The air grew cooler, almost cold, and the sounds of the forest seemed to fade away. The birds stopped chirping, the rustling in the underbrush ceased, and the only sound was the crunch of my boots on the path. I didn't think much of it at first. Forests have a way of changing as you move through them, and I'd been on enough hikes to know that. But something about this felt different. It wasn't just the silence. It was the way the silence seemed to press in on me, like the forest was holding its breath. I kept walking, telling myself it was just my imagination. The trail was still there, faint but clear, and I followed it deeper into the woods. The trees grew even thicker, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The ground beneath my feet grew softer, almost spongy, and the air smelled damp, like rotting leaves and wet earth. I could feel the weight of the forest around me, the way it seemed to close in with every step I took. I don't know how long I walked before I realized I was lost. The trail had disappeared, swallowed up by the underbrush and the thick carpet of leaves on the ground. I stopped and looked around, trying to find some sign of where I'd come from, but everything looked the same. The trees stretched on in every direction, their trunks identical, their branches twisted and gnarled. The light was fading fast, the sun sinking below the horizon and casting long shadows across the forest floor. I pulled out my flashlight and turned it on, the beam cutting through the darkness and illuminating the trees around me. I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest seemed to shift and change with every step I took. The trees that had seemed familiar just moments before now looked foreign, their shapes distorted in the beam of my flashlight. The ground was uneven, the soft earth giving way beneath my boots and making it hard to keep my balance. I could feel panic starting to rise in my chest, a tight, suffocating feeling that made it hard to breathe. I told myself to stay calm, to think clearly, but the forest seemed to have other plans. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to come alive. The trees creaked and groaned in the wind, their branches swaying and twisting like they were reaching out for me. The shadows danced and shifted in the beam of my flashlight, creating shapes that looked almost human. I could hear things moving in the underbrush, the sound of footsteps crunching on leaves, But every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I wanted to run, to get out of there as fast as I could, but I knew that would only make things worse. I had to stay calm, to keep moving, to find my way out. I don't know how long I wandered through the forest. Felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the darkness. The only sound, the crunch of my boots on the ground and the pounding of my heart in my ears. My flashlight began to flicker, the beam growing dimmer with every step I took. I shook it, trying to get it to work, but the light only grew weaker. I could feel the darkness closing in around me, the shadows pressing in from every side. I was alone, completely and utterly alone, in a forest that seemed to want me gone. And then I saw it, a light, faint but steady, shining through the trees. I didn't know if it was real or just my mind playing tricks on me, but I didn't care. I started moving toward it, my legs aching, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The light grew brighter as I got closer, and I could see that it was coming from a small cabin, nestled in a clearing in the woods. The sight of it filled me with a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief because it meant I wasn't alone. Dread because I didn't know what I would find inside. I approached the cabin cautiously, my flashlight flickering in my hand. The cabin was small, made of rough-hewn logs with a slanted roof and a single window. The light was coming from inside, shining through the cracks in the walls and the gaps in the curtains. I could see movement inside, shadows shifting and dancing in the light. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do, but the thought of spending another minute in the forest was enough to push me forward. I knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the clearing. There was no answer, but I could hear movement inside, the sound of footsteps on a wooden floor. I knocked again, louder this time, and the door creaked open. A man stood in the doorway, his face shadowed in the dim light. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a thick beard, and he looked at me with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. "You lost?" he asked, his voice deep and gravelly. I nodded, too exhausted to speak. He stepped aside and motioned for me to come in. The cabin was small but warm, with a fire crackling in the hearth and a single lamp hanging from the ceiling. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with jars of preserves and dried herbs. There was a table in the center of the room with a single chair pushed up against it, and a bed in the corner, covered with a thick wool blanket. The man didn't say much as he motioned for me to sit down. He poured me a cup of tea from a pot on the stove and handed it to me without a word. I took it gratefully, the warmth spreading through my hands and into my chest. I didn't know what to say, so I just sat there, sipping the tea and trying to calm my racing heart. The man sat down across from me, his eyes never leaving my face. "You're lucky you found this place," he said finally. "Not many people do." I nodded, not sure how to respond. The man didn't seem to expect an answer. He just sat there, watching me with those dark, piercing eyes. I could feel the weight of his gaze, the way it seemed to see right through me. It made me uncomfortable, but I was too tired to care. "You can stay here tonight," he said after a long silence, "but you'll have to leave in the morning. This isn't a place for strangers." I nodded again, too exhausted to argue. The man stood up and motioned for me to follow him. He led me to the bed in the corner and handed me the blanket. "Sleep," he said simply. "You'll need your strength." I didn't need to be told twice. I lay down on the bed, the blanket pulled up to my chin, and closed my eyes. The last thing I remember before falling asleep was the sound of the fire crackling in the hearth and the feeling of the man's eyes on me, watching me in the darkness. I woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside the window. The sun was streaming in through the cracks in the walls, casting long beams of light across the room. I sat up, disoriented, and looked around. The cabin was empty, the fire in the hearth reduced to a pile of smoldering embers. The man was gone, the only sign of his presence the blanket that still covered me. I stood up and stretched, my muscles stiff and aching from the night before. I didn't know what time it was, but the sun was high in the sky, which meant I'd slept longer than I'd intended. I looked around the cabin, trying to find some sign of the man, but there was nothing. It was as if he'd never been there at all. I stepped outside, the sunlight warm on my face. The clearing was empty, the trees standing tall and silent around me. I could see the trail leading back into the woods, faint but clear, and I knew it was time to go. I didn't know where the man had gone, or if he'd ever been there at all, but I knew I couldn't stay. I started walking, following the trail back through the woods. The forest seemed different in the daylight, the trees less menacing, the shadows less deep. The birds were chirping again, and I could hear the rustle of leaves in the underbrush. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that makes you forget about the darkness. I don't know how long I walked before I found the trailhead. It was just as I'd left it. I had been planning the hike for weeks. The trail was about 15 miles through the dense Indiana forest, cutting through hills and winding around an old river. I had checked the weather, packed my gear, and set out early in the morning. The plan was simple: hike the trail, camp overnight at the halfway point, and then finish the next day. The first few miles were easy. The air was crisp, and the forest smelled of damp earth and pine. Sunlight cut through the trees in patches, and the only sounds were birds and the occasional rustle of a squirrel in the leaves. It was peaceful, exactly what I wanted. After a few hours, I reached a fork in the trail. The main path continued straight, but another trail veered off to the right. It was narrower and less traveled. I checked my map and saw it was an alternate route that reconnected with the main trail about 4 miles ahead. I decided to take it. It was a little riskier since fewer people traveled it, but that also meant it would be quieter. The trail was rougher than I expected. Tree roots jutted out in all directions, and sections were covered in thick, wet leaves that made the ground slippery. I kept a steady pace, stepping carefully. The further I went, the more I noticed how quiet the forest had become. No birds, no rustling in the underbrush, just the crunch of my boots on the ground. A little after noon, I stopped to eat. I found a fallen log near the edge of a steep drop overlooking a dry creek bed. I sat down, pulled out a protein bar, and took a sip of water. The air was still, too still, felt wrong. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were in the dirt just off the trail. Deep impressions, like someone had been standing there for a long time. They were fresh, but they weren't mine, and they weren't boot prints. Bare feet. I stared at them for a long time. The size was odd. Too large for a child, too narrow for most adults. Something about them made me feel sick, like a slow, twisting discomfort in my stomach. I stood up, packed my things, and moved on. I told myself someone else had taken this route recently. Maybe they were camping nearby. That had to be it. An hour later, I started feeling watched. I'd look back and see nothing but trees. Every so often, I'd hear something, just a quick sound, like a footstep, but when I stopped, silence. The further I walked, the worse it got. I kept catching glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows shifting between the trees. Every time I turned my head, nothing was there. The trail was getting harder to follow, more overgrown. I checked my map. I was still on course, but the sun was lower than I expected. I needed to pick up the pace if I wanted to make camp before dark. Then I found the second set of footprints. These were different, wider, deeper. Something had followed me. My body tensed. I wasn't alone. I forced myself to move. My legs felt stiff, but I kept going, focusing on each step, keeping my breathing steady. I couldn't let myself panic. That's when I heard it. A low, steady breathing. Not mine. I whipped around. Nothing. I stood frozen, listening. The sound had been close. Too close. My heart hammered against my ribs. I kept moving. The light was fading fast. I needed to find a place to camp, somewhere with a clear view of my surroundings. I finally reached a small clearing. It wasn't ideal, but I didn't have a choice. I set up my tent quickly, forcing myself to go through the motions. By the time I was done, it was nearly dark. The woods around me felt massive, pressing in from all sides. I built a small fire and sat close to it, eating another protein bar. Every sound felt amplified. the crackling of the fire, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the distant hoot of an owl. Then came the footsteps, slow, careful, just beyond the firelight. I turned my head, staring into the dark. Nothing. I grabbed my knife, my fingers tight around the handle. My pulse pounded in my ears. I scanned the trees, waiting. The firelight only reached so far. Beyond it, everything was black. I didn't sleep. I sat with my back against a tree, knife in hand, listening. The footsteps would come and go, sometimes close, sometimes farther away. They never fully left. At some point, exhaustion won. I don't remember falling asleep, but I woke to the sound of twigs snapping. My fire had burned low. The air was cold. And there, just at the edge of the dying firelight, was a shape. Person, standing still, watching me. I couldn't make out their face, just the outline. They didn't move, just stood there, silent. My blood ran cold. I gripped my knife, forcing myself to breathe. Then slowly they turned and walked back into the trees. Not running, not sneaking, just walking. I stayed frozen, heart hammering, until the sun began to rise. The moment there was enough light, I packed my things and left. I didn't eat. I didn't stop. I just moved, as fast as I could without running. When I finally reached the main trail again, I nearly collapsed with relief. I made it back to my car just after noon. I didn't look back. I don't know who or what I saw, but I do know one thing. I'll never take that trail again. I should have checked the weather again before heading out. The forecast called for some rain, but nothing major, just a light drizzle, the kind that cools you down instead of soaking you. I had planned this solo hike for weeks, mapping out my route through a lesser-known trail in the national forest, one that promised solitude and a break from the chaos of daily life. I packed light but smart, a sturdy backpack with enough water, a few protein bars, a first aid kit, and my GPS watch. The trail was supposed to loop around a ridge and bring me back to my car by late afternoon. The first few miles were exactly what I needed. The air smelled like damp earth, and the trees swayed gently in the breeze. I took my time, soaking in the silence, stopping here and there to adjust my boots or take a sip from my water bottle. The trail was narrow but well-trodden, cutting through thick underbrush and weaving between towering pines. I didn't see another soul, which was perfect. Then, about 5 miles in, the trail started changing. The dirt path turned uneven, almost as if it hadn't been maintained in years. Roots jutted out like twisted fingers, rocks scattered where the ground had eroded. I kept going, assuming it would clear up soon. But then I noticed something strange. The trail markers were missing. Those little blue blazes painted on tree trunks had been consistent earlier, popping up every 100 yards or so. Now nothing. I pulled out my phone. No signal. Not surprising this deep into the forest, but I still didn't like it. My GPS watch showed I was still on course, so I pushed on. About 20 minutes later, the drizzle turned into a steady rain. The dirt beneath my boots softened, turning into slick mud. Every step required more focus. That's when I saw the first sign that something was really wrong. A boot print, but not just any boot print. One that was fresh. Too fresh. It wasn't mine, I was sure of that. The tread was different, and it faced the opposite direction. Someone had been here recently, walking back the way I came. I scanned the area, but everything was still. Just the sound of rain hitting the leaves. My gut twisted a little, but I wasn't about to turn around yet. I had planned this hike carefully. I wasn't lost. I just needed to keep going. Another 20 minutes passed, and the rain got heavier. I adjusted my hood, blinking away droplets. That's when I saw something that made me stop cold. A torn piece of fabric dangled from a low-hanging branch. Dark green, maybe from a jacket or backpack. The edges were frayed, like it had been ripped. I hesitated, then reached for it. It was damp, but not soaked. It hadn't been here long. That uneasy feeling in my stomach grew. My first thought was that someone else had gotten lost out here, maybe injured, but there were no other sounds, no distant voices calling for help. Just the rain, the wind, and my own breathing. I kept moving, my pace quickening. I was sure I'd be back on a clearer path soon. The problem was the terrain was getting worse. The mud sucked at my boots, and the slope had become steeper without me realizing it. I checked my GPS again. The signal flickered weakly, then cut out completely. Just as I was about to pocket it, I saw something that made my chest tighten. Another boot print, but this time it was deeper, pressed into the mud. The rain hadn't washed it away yet. Someone was close. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing, just endless trunks stretching into the misty distance. My skin prickled, and I clenched my fists. I wasn't going to panic. I just needed to keep going. But I moved faster now, ignoring the ache in my legs. Then I smelled it. A sharp, sour odor. Something that didn't belong in the damp, earthy scent of the forest. It hit me hard and I gagged. Rot. Like something had been left to decay. My instincts screamed at me to leave. I picked up my pace, practically jogging now. My boots slipped on the wet ground, and I nearly went down, catching myself against a tree trunk. And that's when I saw it. A shape partially hidden behind the underbrush. Not an animal, not a fallen branch, something else. I squinted through the rain, my heart pounding. It was a backpack, dark green, ripped open at the seams. Scattered around it were things that shouldn't be there. Shoes, a jacket, a half-crushed water bottle. And just beyond that, something pale, barely visible through the brush. I didn't move closer. I knew what it was. I turned and ran. My breath came fast, and my legs burned. The rain blurred everything, but I didn't stop. I didn't check my GPS. I didn't care where I was going, just away. My mind screamed at me to keep moving. I didn't know who or what was out there, but I wasn't going to wait to find out. I ran until my lungs felt like they would burst, until my thighs ached so bad I had to stop. I bent over, hands on my knees, sucking in air. The forest was silent again, except for the rain. I forced myself to listen, to strain for any sound of movement. Nothing. Somehow, I had made it back to a more familiar part of the trail. A few hundred yards ahead, I saw something that nearly brought me to my knees. One of the blue trail markers. I stumbled toward it, gripping the tree for support. I was back on track. I wasn't lost anymore. I forced myself to walk, every step feeling like I was pushing through mud, even when the ground was solid again. When I finally saw the parking lot, my car sitting there like a beacon, I nearly cried. I threw my pack in the back seat, got in, and locked the doors. My hands trembled as I started the engine. The rain pounded against the windshield, but I didn't care. I was safe. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced back at the trailhead one last time. There was no sign of anyone else. No figures emerging from the trees. Nothing to prove I had just seen what I saw. But I knew better. Something or someone was out there, and I wasn't going back to find out who. I started my hike before sunrise, my pack strapped tight against my back, the cold morning air pressing against my skin. The trailhead was quiet, only the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a waking bird breaking the silence. I had chosen this hike because it was remote, deep in the woods where few people ventured. It was supposed to be a challenge. Steep inclines, rough terrain, and a path that wasn't well maintained. That was what I wanted, to be alone, away from everything. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail wound through thick trees, their trunks towering above me, filtering the sunlight as it slowly crept over the horizon. The ground was uneven, roots twisting up like veins, rocks jutting out at odd angles. I kept my eyes down, watching my footing carefully. The last thing I needed was to twist an ankle this far from help. About an hour in, I came across a stream cutting across the trail. The water was clear, moving fast over the rocks, and I knelt to refill my bottle. It was cold, fresh. I splashed some on my face, letting the chill wake me up fully. As I stood, I glanced around. Something felt off. I couldn't place it, but the air was heavier. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no insects, just the sound of the stream. I shook it off and kept moving. The trail climbed higher, and my legs started to burn from the effort. Sweat dripped down my back, my breath coming in steady, controlled bursts. The trees thinned out slightly, allowing me glimpses of the valley below. It was beautiful. Rolling hills, endless green stretching out in every direction. I took a moment to appreciate it before pressing on. By midday, I reached a fork in the trail. My map showed both paths leading to the same point, but one was longer, winding through more difficult terrain. The other was shorter but looked steeper. I chose the harder route. I wanted the challenge. The path narrowed, the trees closing in tight. Branches reached out, snagging my clothes, scratching my arms. The incline was brutal, forcing me to use my hands to steady myself on the rocks. My breath was heavy, sweat dripping into my eyes. Every step was a struggle, but I pushed forward. Then I noticed it. The forest around me had changed. The trees were different. The air smelled wrong. A damp, rotting scent like something decaying. My stomach twisted. I paused, listening. Still nothing. Just my own breathing, too loud in my ears. I told myself it was just my imagination. The deeper into the woods I went, the more my mind played tricks on me. That was normal. I kept going. After another hour, I reached a small clearing. The ground was packed dirt. No grass, no undergrowth, just bare earth. In the center, a pile of rocks stacked deliberately, like a marker. I hesitated. There were no markings, no signs of a trail continuing. My map didn't show anything here. I stepped forward, examining the rocks. They were smooth, worn down by time, carefully balanced. Not random. Someone had put them here. Recently. The thought made my skin crawl. I wasn't alone. I turned, scanning the trees. Nothing. Just the silent woods. But I felt it now, a pressure, something watching. I took a step back. Then another. My foot hit something soft. I looked down. The ground beneath me had shifted slightly, like it wasn't solid. I crouched, brushing away the dirt. Cloth. My breath caught. It was fabric, buried just beneath the surface. Dark, stiff with age. Pulled at it, my fingers shaking. It gave way easily, revealing more. A jacket, then a sleeve. I stood up so fast I nearly lost my balance. My heart was pounding, my throat dry. This wasn't right. None of this was right. I had to get out of here. Now, I turned and started back the way I came, my steps quick, controlled. But something was wrong. The trail looked different. I followed the same path, but the trees didn't look the same. The landmarks I had passed earlier were gone. My stomach twisted. I checked my compass. The needle spun wildly before settling in the wrong direction. That wasn't possible. I turned again, trying to find anything familiar. Nothing. The trail was gone. Panic clawed at my chest, but I forced it down. I had a GPS. I pulled it out, my hands shaking as I turned it on. No signal. I was lost. I took a deep breath. I had been hiking for years. I knew how to handle this. Stay calm, stay logical. I had supplies. I had time. I just needed to retrace my steps. I moved carefully, marking trees with my knife, trying to find the path again. The forest seemed to shift around me, the trees pressing in closer. My breathing was too loud. The air felt heavier. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine. Slow, deliberate. Just beyond the trees. I froze. My mind raced. Could be an animal. A deer, maybe. But deer didn't move like that. This was controlled. Intentional. I gripped my knife tighter, my pulse hammering in my ears. I scanned the trees, but I saw nothing. Just shadows shifting. Then the footsteps stopped. Silence. A weight settled in my chest. I wasn't alone. Someone was out here with me, watching, waiting. I forced myself to move, walking faster now. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just needed to get out. I needed open space, a signal, anything. Then I saw it. Ahead, through the trees, an old cabin. The wood was dark with age, the windows empty, hollow. No signs of life, no path leading to it. Just sitting there, hidden deep in the forest. I hesitated. I didn't want to go in. Every instinct screamed at me to stay away, but I had no choice. The sun was going down. I needed shelter. I stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath my weight. Dust floated in the air, thick and suffocating. The place was empty. No furniture, no signs of recent use. Just four walls and a roof. Then I heard it again. The footsteps, closer now, right outside. I held my breath. My hand tightened around my knife. The door was the only way out. If someone was out there, I had nowhere to go. I waited, every second stretching endlessly. The footsteps moved around the cabin. Slow, searching. Then they stopped, right by the door. I gritted my teeth, my body tense. Ready. If they came in, I would fight. I had to. The door handle shifted. I braced myself. Then nothing. Silence. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The sun dipped below the trees, darkness swallowing the cabin. I didn't move. I didn't sleep. I just waited. When morning came, I stepped outside. The forest was still. No footprints. No signs of anyone ever being there. I ran. I don't remember how long it took, but I found the road eventually. My car was still there, untouched. I got in, locked the doors, and drove without looking back. I don't know what I saw. I don't know who was out there, but I never went hiking alone again. I started early, just before sunrise, when the air was still crisp and damp. The trailhead was empty except for my car and a few scattered beer bottles left behind from the night before. I adjusted my pack, double-checked my water supply, and set off. The first stretch of the hike was easy, wide, well-maintained, and flanked by towering pines that swayed gently in the morning breeze. Birds called out to one another, and every so often, I heard the distant rush of a stream. I had planned this hike for weeks, studying the maps, reading trip reports, making sure I knew what to expect. It was supposed to be a loop, about 18 miles total, something I could finish before sunset if I kept a steady pace. I had my GPS watch on, my phone fully charged, and even printed out a paper map just in case. I wasn't worried. I had done harder hikes before. About 4 miles in, the trail narrowed and became rockier. The trees pressed in closer, and the cheerful morning light barely made it through the dense canopy. I welcomed the solitude. It was the whole reason I hiked, to get away, to feel like I was the only person left in the world for a little while. I came across my first marker, an old wooden sign nailed to a tree. It was supposed to point in two directions, one for the loop and one for an out-and-back side trail to a viewpoint. But the sign was so worn, the words had faded into the wood. I pulled out my map and checked my GPS. Left was the loop, right was the viewpoint. I went left. The deeper I went, the less maintained the trail became. I had expected this. The reports mentioned that the back half of the loop was less traveled. Fallen branches crisscrossed the path, and at one point, I had to climb over the trunk of a massive tree that had fallen in a storm. No big deal. I kept moving. It was about midday when I noticed the silence. The birds had stopped. The wind had stopped. Even my footsteps seemed quieter against the packed dirt. I chalked it up to exhaustion. I had been hiking for hours, and the weight of my pack was starting to wear on me. I sat down on a rock to eat a granola bar and drink some water. As I chewed, I glanced at my map again. I should have been coming up on a creek crossing soon, but I hadn't seen or heard any water. I pulled out my phone to check my GPS. The signal flickered, weak but present. I was still on the trail, or at least I was where the trail was supposed to be. But the terrain around me didn't match what I had seen on the map. There should have been a clearing, a small meadow before the creek. But all I saw were trees, dense and unmoving. Something wasn't right. I decided to push forward. If I had veered off the trail, I'd backtrack after another mile. No need to panic. But the more I walked, the more uneasy I felt. The trees were too close together, their trunks too similar, as if they were repeating themselves. I kept thinking I saw the same twisted pine over and over. Then I found the footprints. They weren't mine. They were older, partially washed away by recent rain, but still visible in the damp earth. Someone else had been here. But the problem was the prints weren't moving forward. They were scattered, overlapping like whoever made them had been pacing or circling. I stopped. The back of my neck prickled. I wasn't alone. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. Nothing. No movement, no sound. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I had two choices. Keep going and hope I found my way back onto the trail, or turn around and retrace my steps. I decided to turn around. The footprints followed me. I didn't notice at first, not until I checked again a few hundred yards later. The same prints, the same scattered pattern. But now they were mixed with fresher ones. My heart started pounding. I forced myself to walk faster, not to run. Running was stupid. Running made noise. Running made you trip. I kept my eyes forward, focused on the path ahead. I could still make it back before dark. I just needed to. A branch snapped behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance. The trees were still. The trail was empty, but the footprints were different now. They were deeper, as if whoever made them had been standing there for a long time. Watching me, I moved faster. My legs burned, but I didn't stop. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was tired, that I had misread the footprints. But I knew better. The sun dipped lower. Shadows stretched across the ground, twisting and warping. I checked my GPS again. Nothing. No signal. I kept walking. I should have been close by now. I should have recognized something. But the trees were all the same. I saw something ahead. A shape, a structure. Relief flooded me until I got closer. It was a cabin. It wasn't supposed to be there. There was nothing about a cabin on the maps. It was old, weathered, half sunken into the earth like it had been abandoned for decades. The door was missing. The windows were empty holes. Something about it made my stomach twist. I didn't want to go near it, but the trail led straight to it. Or at least what I thought was the trail. My head pounded. I needed to get out. Now, I turned sharply to the left, off the path, off whatever had led me here. I pushed through the undergrowth, branches scraping against my arms, my face. I didn't care. I kept moving until I stumbled out onto a wide, flat trail. The real trail. I recognized it instantly. I had passed this way hours ago. I nearly sobbed with relief. I ran. My legs ached, but I ran. I didn't look back. I made it to my car just as the last light faded from the sky. I threw my pack into the back seat and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so badly I barely got the keys into the ignition. As I pulled away, I glanced into my rearview mirror. The trailhead was empty, but for a split second, just before the trees swallowed the road, I thought I saw something standing at the edge of the woods, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again, and I will never, ever go back there. I checked my pack one last time before setting off. Water, extra layers, protein bars, my GPS, and a small first aid kit. I had everything I needed. I had planned this hike for weeks, mapping out the trail, checking the weather, and making sure I had the right gear. It was supposed to be a simple solo trip. Nothing extreme, just a weekend in the woods to clear my head. I had hiked alone before and I liked the solitude. The trail started easy enough, a dirt path winding through thick trees. The morning air was crisp, and the only sounds were birds chirping and my boots crunching against the leaves. I felt good, moving at a steady pace, taking deep breaths of the fresh air. I had a long day ahead, and I wanted to reach a ridge before sunset. From there, I would set up camp, enjoy the view, and head back down in the morning. Simple. A few miles in, the trail got narrower. The trees grew denser, blocking out most of the sunlight. I had expected this. I checked my GPS. Everything was on track. I moved forward, stepping over roots and rocks, careful with my footing. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own breathing. I tried to ignore it. Sometimes, forests just got quiet. Then I noticed the footprints. They were fresh, pressed deep into the damp dirt, heading in the same direction as me. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail, and I had started early. The prints looked heavy, like whoever made them was carrying something. I stopped, scanning the trees. Nothing, just empty woods. I told myself it was probably a hunter or another hiker. Nothing to worry about. I kept moving. Another hour passed, and the trail became rougher. The incline was steep, and I had to use my hands to steady myself on rocks. Sweat dripped down my back despite the cool air. I checked my GPS again, still on track. But when I looked up, something felt wrong. The footprints were gone. I hadn't seen them in a while, but I hadn't thought much of it. Now I realized they had just stopped. There was no turnoff, no sign of someone stepping off the path. Just an abrupt end. My stomach tightened. Maybe they had doubled back. Maybe I had missed another trail. I took a deep breath and shook it off. I had to keep moving. By mid-afternoon, I reached the ridge. The view was incredible. Miles of forest stretching out below me, golden light filtering through the trees. I took a moment to drink some water, catch my breath, and enjoy the silence. But something still felt off. That unease I had felt earlier hadn't gone away. It sat heavy in my chest. I set up my small tent, made a quick meal, and tried to relax. But as the sun started dipping behind the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I scanned the woods, looking for movement, listening for anything out of place. The silence was suffocating. No wind, no bugs, just nothing. Then I heard it. A single, deliberate step on the dirt. Close. My entire body froze. I held my breath, ears straining. Another step. Closer this time. Slow. Purposeful. I reached for my flashlight and flicked it on, aiming it into the trees. Nothing. Just thick trunks and shadows. I told myself it was an animal, but my gut knew better. I wasn't alone. My hand tightened around my knife, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the sound stopped. I sat there for what felt like hours, gripping my knife, eyes darting between the trees. But nothing happened. No more sounds. No movement. Eventually, exhaustion won. I lay in my tent, staring at the thin fabric walls, listening to the silence outside. I didn't sleep. The first light, I packed up fast. I wanted out. My unease had turned into full-blown fear, and I wasn't sticking around to find out why. I moved quickly, almost jogging down the trail. Every snap of a twig sent a spike of adrenaline through my body. I just needed to make it back to my car. Then I saw it. The footprints. Fresh, deep, but this time, they were facing the other direction. Someone had followed me up, and now they were ahead of me. My throat tightened. I gripped my knife, scanning the trees. Nothing. But I knew I wasn't alone. I forced myself to move forward, every step calculated, every sound magnified. The trail twisted, and then, up ahead, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A shirt, hanging from a tree. My shirt, one I had packed but hadn't worn. It was tied in a knot, swaying slightly in the breeze. My stomach lurched. Someone had been in my pack. Someone had been in my camp. Panic took over. I moved fast, nearly running. I didn't care about twisting an ankle or getting lost. I just needed to get out. The trail blurred past me, the trees closing in. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to move faster. Finally, after what felt like forever, I saw my car. Relief slammed into me so hard I almost collapsed. I yanked open the door, threw my pack inside, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I didn't look back. Couldn't. I just drove. I never found out who was out there with me. I never found out how they got into my pack, how they moved so silently, or what they wanted. But I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone. I had planned the hike for weeks. A solo trip into the wilderness, just me and the trail. I had done plenty of solo hikes before, but nothing this long, 3 days, deep in the backcountry, following an old logging road that had been swallowed up by the forest decades ago. I wanted solitude, a challenge, and a break from everything. The trailhead was 2 hours from the nearest town, a small pull-off on the side of a 2-lane highway. My car was the only one there, which didn't surprise me. It wasn't a popular trail. I had read about it in an old hiking forum, a place forgotten by most. The lack of crowds was exactly why I picked it. I checked my pack one last time: tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, first aid kit. Everything was in order. The first day was uneventful. The trail was overgrown in places, but the old road was still easy to follow. Birds chirped, branches creaked in the wind, and the smell of pine filled the air. It was peaceful. I made good time, covering nearly 12 miles before setting up camp near a small creek. I cooked a quick meal, sat by my fire, and listened to the quiet. No distant hum of cars, no voices, just the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. I slept soundly. On the second day, the trail became rougher. The trees grew thicker, and the underbrush clawed at my legs. I lost the trail a couple of times, but always found it again. Around midday, I reached a clearing where the remains of an old cabin stood, just a skeleton of rotting logs and rusted nails. It had likely been a logger's cabin back when this area was still worked. I poked around a bit, found some rusted cans and a broken bottle, then moved on. By late afternoon, I realized I had made a mistake. The trail had vanished. It hadn't been great to begin with, but now it was gone completely. I pulled out my map and compass, double-checked my GPS. I was close to where I needed to be, but the path just wasn't there anymore. The forest had swallowed it whole. I tried to backtrack, but that only confused me more. Trees looked the same from every angle. The sinking feeling in my gut was impossible to ignore. I wasn't lost. Not yet. I still knew my general direction. I could still navigate. I just needed to stay calm. I kept moving, pushing through the undergrowth, following the terrain as best I could. The ground sloped downward, leading me into a dense thicket of trees. The air felt different here, heavier, stiller. I hadn't seen a single animal for hours. Then I found the campsite. It wasn't old. Maybe a few months, maybe less. A tent, faded blue, partially collapsed. A rusted cooking pot. A fire pit filled with ashes, but no fresh wood. Someone had been here, but they hadn't packed up and left. They had just stopped. I called out, but my voice felt small in the trees. No answer. The tent zipper was halfway open. I hesitated before pulling it back. Inside, a sleeping bag was laid out, unzipped. A backpack half open. Clothes, a flashlight, a knife, all normal camping gear, and a notebook. It was tucked beside the sleeping bag. I flipped through it, scanning the pages. Most of it was normal dates, small notes about the weather, miles hiked. But near the end, the writing changed. The letters were jagged, uneven, the words frantic. Something is wrong. I keep hearing something at night. It's not an animal. I woke up and my fire was out. I didn't put it out. I'm not alone. The last entry was just 2 words. Help me. I stared at the page, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The air around me felt thick, suffocating. I turned slowly, scanning the forest. Felt different now. The peace I had enjoyed was gone. Every tree, every shadow felt like it was watching me. I should have left right then, but I hesitated. What if they were still out here? Hurt? Lost? I checked the backpack. Food, water, everything was still there. No signs of a struggle, just abandoned. I left the camp behind, moving faster now. I needed to find the trail again, get back on track. But the deeper I went, the worse it got. The terrain was rough, uneven. My legs burned. The sun was sinking lower. I needed to stop, set up camp, but the thought of stopping made my skin crawl. That night, I didn't sleep. I set up my tent in a small clearing, built a fire, and sat with my back against a tree. Every snap of a branch made me flinch. The silence was unbearable. No insects, no wind, just nothing. At some point, exhaustion took over. I must have dozed off because I woke with a start. The fire had burned low, just glowing embers now. Something was different. The air smelled wrong, like old, damp wood, and my pack was open. I was sure I had closed it. Positive. My heart pounded as I scanned the darkness. Nothing moved. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Not an animal. Human. I didn't wait. I grabbed my pack and bolted. I ran blind through the trees, branches tearing at my arms. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing onto the damp ground, gasping for breath. Dawn came slowly. I forced myself up, shaking, exhausted. I had to get out. No more trying to find the old trail. Just get out. I hiked nonstop, barely pausing for water. By late afternoon, I found a river. I followed it downstream, knowing it would lead me somewhere. And it did. A road, barely more than a dirt path, but enough. I flagged down a truck, barely able to explain what had happened. The driver took me back to town, where I sat in a gas station parking lot for an hour, just breathing. I never reported it. Who would I report it to? I hadn't seen anything. There was no crime, just an abandoned campsite and a feeling I still can't shake. I haven't hiked alone since. I had been hiking for years, always seeking the quiet and solitude of the wilderness. It was something about the stillness, the way the air felt cleaner, the ground softer under my boots. It made me feel like I could breathe easier. I had done solo hikes before, sometimes overnights, sometimes longer. This trip was supposed to be 3 days out in the mountains, a familiar route, nothing too technical. I started early that morning, just as the sun was breaking over the tree line. The trail was empty, which was what I wanted. I liked having the quiet to myself, no forced small talk with other hikers, no distractions. The trail wound through thick pine forest, the scent of sap and earth filling the air. It had rained the night before, and the ground was damp, the mud clinging to my boots. The first few hours were uneventful. I made good time, stopping only to take a sip of water or adjust my pack. The trail was familiar, but something felt different this time. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, just an odd, nagging feeling that I wasn't alone. I had seen no other hikers, no fresh boot prints in the mud, but I kept catching myself glancing over my shoulder. By midday, I reached a small clearing where I planned to rest. I sat on a fallen log, eating a granola bar, listening to the distant sound of a stream. That's when I noticed it, something off in the tree line. Not movement exactly, just a break in the pattern, like when your brain registers something before you do. A shape, maybe, but when I looked directly at it, there was nothing, just trees. I shook it off and kept moving. By the time I reached the ridge, the sun was starting to dip lower in the sky. I set up camp near a small, sheltered spot beneath an overhang of rock. It wasn't my usual site, but I was tired and wanted to settle in before dark. I built a small fire, ate my freeze-dried meal, and watched the last light fade through the trees. That feeling was still there. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks. I had been alone too long. Maybe I was just on edge because I wasn't as deep into the season as I normally was. Hadn't shaken off the city yet. I crawled into my sleeping bag and closed my eyes, listening to the fire crackle. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. The fire was almost out, just faint embers glowing in the dark. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. Then I heard it, a sound just beyond the glow of the fire. A soft, deliberate step on damp leaves. Deer. It had to be a deer. I stayed still, barely breathing, listening. Another step, closer this time. Not a deer. A deer moves differently, lighter, quicker. This was slow, careful. I reached for my flashlight, fingers tightening around the cold metal. I clicked it on and aimed it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, the low undergrowth. Nothing. I exhaled and turned it off, lying back down. My body was tense, my mind alert. I listened for a long time, but the sound didn't return. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I packed up quickly. I didn't feel like staying another night. I told myself it was just nerves, that I was being paranoid. But as I shouldered my pack and turned back toward the trail, I hesitated. There, in the mud just beyond my campsite, were footprints. Not mine. I crouched down, examining them. They were fresh. A single set, barefoot, the toes digging deep into the damp earth. Someone had been standing there, watching. A cold wave of fear washed over me. I looked around, scanning the trees, but there was nothing. The woods were still silent, but that feeling, that gnawing, crawling feeling, was stronger than ever. I started walking fast. I didn't run. I didn't want to seem like prey, but my pulse was pounding, my skin crawling with the sense that I wasn't alone. I kept glancing back, expecting to see someone stepping out of the trees. Nothing. I pushed forward, my legs burning, my breathing heavy. I had never felt like this on a hike before. I had seen bears, mountain lions, even been caught in a sudden storm with no shelter. But this was different. This was human. I hiked without stopping, barely taking a sip of water. I just wanted to be out of the woods, back to my car, back to civilization. The feeling didn't go away. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made my heart hammer in my chest. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was exhausted. My truck was the only vehicle in the small dirt lot. I unlocked the door, threw my pack inside, and got in, locking the doors immediately. I sat there for a moment, catching my breath. Then, out of instinct, I looked up. There, at the edge of the trees just beyond the lot, stood a figure. Tall, still, barefoot, watching. I didn't hesitate. I started the truck, threw it into reverse, and peeled out of there, gravel spitting from my tires. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was miles down the road, my hands shaking on the wheel. I haven't been back to that trail since, and I don't plan to.